1907 Fall Asleep, to Hilarious History, The Gilded Gulp, and The Great White Tourist, by Mark Twain. Copyright 2026. James Henderson. Chapter 1. The Panic of 1907. Or, Why You Should Never Build a Civilization on Copper and Hubris. October in New York is usually a fine time for a stroll, provided you aren't walking toward a bank where you've left your life savings. In 1907, the air didn't just smell of roasted chestnuts in the coming winter. It smelled of singed reputations and the distinct metallic tang of a cooling copper market. It was a year when the American public learned a very expensive lesson, that trust is a lovely word for a sundial, but a terrible name for a place to keep your money when the sun goes down. The brothers Heinze and the Copper Con. It all began with a gentleman named F. Augustus Heinze. Now, Augustus was what we call a copper king, a title that sounds much more regal than it actually is. In practice, being a copper king meant you spent a great deal of time in Montana trying to convince the earth to give up its secrets, and an even greater amount of time in New York trying to convince investors that those secrets were worth more than the dirt they were buried in. Augustus and his brother Otto had a brilliant plan. It was the kind of plan that sounds magnificent after 3 brandies and looks like a suicide note the following morning. They decided they were going to corner the stock of the United Copper Company. For the uninitiated, cornering a stock is a bit like trying to buy every umbrella in London just as a thunderstorm begins. You wait for the shorts, those pessimistic souls who bet that the price will go down, to realize they've sold umbrellas they don't actually own. Then you step out from the shadows, umbrellaless and grinning, and demand they pay you £1,000 for the privilege of not getting wet. The Heinze brothers thought they owned enough of the company to force these short sellers into a corner and squeeze them until gold coins popped out of their ears. But they had forgotten one fundamental rule of the universe. Arithmetic is a cold, unfeeling mistress. It turns out they didn't own nearly as much as they thought. When they tried to execute the squeeze on Monday, October 14th, the market didn't gasp. It laughed. The stock price of United Copper didn't soar. It plummeted like a lead balloon filled with smaller, heavier lead balloons. The contagion of the trusts. Now, in a sensible world, 2 brothers losing their shirts in a copper scheme would be a private tragedy, or at least a very funny story at the club. But 1907 was not a sensible world. The Heinze brothers were deeply entwined with several banks and, more importantly, trust companies. A trust in 1907 was a peculiar beast. It was essentially a bank that had been allowed to skip school the day they taught safety and regulation. They were the wild youngsters of the financial district, taking depositors' money and throwing it into high-stakes gambles that would make a riverboat gambler blush. They had no central bank to back them up, because the United States, in its infinite wisdom, had decided a central bank was undemocratic, and they kept very little cash on hand. They operated entirely on the concept of faith. The problem with faith is that it is highly flammable. When the Heinze scheme collapsed, the public looked at the banks associated with them and began to wonder. And wondering is the first stage of a bank run. The second stage is walking briskly. The third stage is sprinting with a wheelbarrow. The fall of the Knickerbocker. The spark that turned this smolder into a firestorm was the Knickerbocker Trust Company. It was the third largest trust in New York, housed in a building so grand and marble-clad that it practically screamed, "Your money is safe here. Look at these Corinthian columns." Its president, Barney, had been seen dining with the Heinze brothers. In the delicate ecosystem of Wall Street, dining with a loser is considered a contagious disease. On October 21st, the National Bank of Commerce announced it would no longer clear checks for the Knickerbocker. This was the financial equivalent of a doctor walking out of a hospital room and whispering, "Well, he's a goner." The next morning, Tuesday, October 22nd, the panic officially moved from the newspapers to the pavement. The architecture of fear. If you want to see humanity at its most primitive, don't go to the jungle. Go to 34th Street and 5th Avenue when a bank is running out of cash. By 10 a.m., the line outside the Knickerbocker Trust was a sea of silk hats and wool coats. These weren't just the poor, these were the better sort. But when a man's life savings are at stake, a silk hat provides very little protection against the urge to elbow a grandmother in the ribs. The scene was a masterpiece of Victorian chaos. Men who had spent their lives discussing civic virtue were suddenly shouting profanities at closed brass gates. The air was thick with the smell of damp wool and desperation. Inside, the tellers were frantically counting out gold and silver, watching the piles shrink with every person who reached the window. The Knickerbocker lasted less than 3 hours. At 12:30 p.m., the tellers stopped counting. The doors were locked. A notice was posted. The Knickerbocker had failed. The dominoes began to wobble. The collapse of the Knickerbocker was like dropping a boulder into a very small, very nervous pond. The ripples turned into waves, and the waves turned into tsunamis. If the Knickerbocker could fall, who was safe? The crowd moved down the street to the Trust Company of America, then to the Lincoln Trust. The contagion was spreading through the telephone lines and the telegraph wires. It jumped across the Atlantic to London. It crept westward to Chicago and San Francisco. The realization hit the American public like a bucket of ice water. The entire Gilded Age was a magnificent stage set. We had built skyscrapers that touched the clouds, railroads that spanned the continent, and mansions that rivaled the palaces of Europe, but we had forgotten to check if the dirt beneath us could hold a nickel's worth of weight. We had no Federal Reserve, no deposit insurance, no safety net. We were a nation of 80 million people, flying a very large, very heavy airplane, and we had just discovered that nobody was in the cockpit. By the evening of October 23rd, the lights were burning late in every office on Wall Street. The stock market was in a free fall. The city's smaller banks were out of cash. The call money rate, the interest charged on loans to brokers, soared from 2% to 150%. At 150%, you aren't borrowing money. You're selling your soul and promising to pay interest on it. New York was on the verge of total atmospheric collapse. The world was watching, the depositors were screaming, and the government in Washington was doing what it does best during a crisis, looking confused and hoping someone else would fix it. The arrival of the nose. And that is when the carriage rolled up to the door of a massive, silent library on 36th Street. Out stepped a man with a gaze that could melt lead and a nose that was, by all accounts, a geographical landmark in its own right. J. Pierpont Morgan had arrived. He didn't come with an army, and he didn't come with the law. He came with a cigar, a deck of cards, and the absolute conviction that he was the only adult left in the room. The panic of 1907 was about to meet its match, but it was going to cost the country its pride, and it was going to happen behind locked doors. The streets are currently full of angry men, and the banks are out of gold. J.P. Morgan is sitting in his study, staring at a stack of ledgers like a judge deciding which prisoners to send to the gallows. Chapter 2. J.P. Morgan plays solitaire with the economy. Or the most expensive game of locked room mystery in history. While the rest of New York was busy trying to climb over their neighbors to reach a bank teller, one man was sitting in a room filled with dead Europeans' manuscripts, waiting for the world to admit it was bankrupt. That man was John Pierpont Morgan, and his library at 36th and Madison was about to become the most important room in a country that officially claimed it didn't believe in kings. To understand J.P. Morgan, you must first understand the nose. It was a nose that had its own zip code. Afflicted with rhinophyma, it was a bulbous, purple, terrifying landscape of a feature that seemed to grow more indignant as the economy soured. It was said that looking Morgan in the eye was like staring into the headlights of an oncoming express train, a train that owned the tracks, the coal, and the soul of the engineer. He was 70 years old, suffering from a cold, and significantly more powerful than the United States Treasury. The secretary and the savior. By late October, the Secretary of the Treasury, George Cortelyou, arrived in New York with a suitcase full of government money and the weary expression of a man who has realized his boss is out of his depth. President Teddy Roosevelt was out west, likely wrestling a bear or shouting at a mountain, leaving the financial wreckage of the nation to a man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Cortelyou met Morgan in his library. It was a room that smelled of expensive tobacco, ancient vellum, and the quiet, heavy weight of absolute certainty. Morgan looked at the $25 million the government had brought to help save the banks and likely thought it was a cute down payment. He knew that money alone wouldn't stop the panic. Only the illusion of infinite money would do that. Morgan didn't just want to stop the run, he wanted to reorganize the world. He was the only man who could command the attention of every banker in the city, mostly because they were all terrified he would stop speaking to them, which in 1907 was the financial equivalent of being cast out of a lifeboat into shark-infested waters. The Great Lockdown. Morgan's strategy was simple, elegant, and entirely illegal by any modern standard of kidnapping. He invited the presidents of the city's remaining trust companies to his library. These were men who wore coats that cost more than a Midwestern farm, yet they arrived shivering. They were ushered into the West Room, a red-walled sanctuary of high art. And then, quite simply, Morgan locked the door. He didn't just lock it metaphorically, he took the key. Morgan then retreated to his private study to play solitaire. This is not a literary flourish. The man literally sat by a fire, flipping cards and sipping port, while the titans of American finance sat in the next room, stewing in their own cold sweat. Every so often, he would walk in, tell them they hadn't come up with enough money yet to save each other, and then walked back out to finish his game of cards. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. He was treating the leaders of the American economy like naughty school children who wouldn't be allowed to go to recess until they finished their arithmetic. The $25 million poker game. The problem was the Trust Company of America. It was bleeding cash. If it fell, the entire deck of cards would follow. Morgan told the other bankers they had to pony up $25 million to keep it afloat. "I don't have the money," one banker reportedly whined. "You'll find it," Morgan essentially replied, before returning to his solitaire. It was a standoff of the highest order. The bankers argued. They paced. They looked at the Gutenberg Bible on the shelf and probably wondered if they could hawk it for a few million. Meanwhile, Morgan waited. He knew that the fear of him was greater than the fear of the market. He was the lender of last resort, a title he had awarded himself because the government was too busy being democratic to actually function. Around 2 a.m., Morgan walked into the room with a document. It was an agreement for each bank to contribute to a massive rescue fund. He handed the pen to the first man. "There's the paper," Morgan said. "Sign it." And they did. They signed because the alternative was a world where J.P. Morgan didn't exist to catch them, and that was a world none of them could imagine. The doors were unlocked, the bankers stumbled out into the cold New York night, and the bailout was born. The Moore and Schley crisis, a side of steel. Just when the panic seemed to be cooling, a new fire broke out. A major brokerage firm, Moore and Schley, was about to collapse. They had used shares of the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company, TCI, as collateral for their loans. If Moore and Schley went under, the banks holding those shares would dump them. The market would crash again, and the previous night's work would be for naught. Morgan, never one to let a good crisis go to waste, saw an opportunity. He suggested that his own company, U.S. Steel, buy TCI. This would solve the debt problem and, purely by coincidence, give J.P. Morgan a total monopoly on the American steel industry. There was just one small hurdle: the Sherman Antitrust Act. President Roosevelt was famous for trust busting, and he generally frowned upon men creating massive monopolies over breakfast. Morgan sent 2 of his lieutenants to Washington on a midnight train. They reached the White House just as Roosevelt was finishing his morning coffee. They explained that if the president didn't waive the antitrust rules for this one specific tiny multi-million-dollar merger, the entire American economy would disintegrate by noon. Roosevelt, faced with a choice between his principles and a total national collapse, chose the latter. He gave his blessing. Morgan had not only saved the economy, he had coerced the most powerful man in the world into helping him build a monopoly. It was the ultimate buy one, get one free deal. The birth of the bailout. By the time the smoke cleared, the panic of 1907 was over. The market stabilized, the lines at the banks dwindled, and J.P. Morgan went back to collecting art. But the victory left a sour taste in the mouth of the Republic. The realization that the entire United States of America rested on the whims and the liver function of one 70-year-old man in a library was, to put it mildly, unsettling. The public began to ask, if Morgan could save us, does that mean he also has the power to break us? We had been saved by a monarch in a country that had fought a revolution to get rid of them. The bailout had worked, but it had revealed a terrifying truth. The government was merely a decorative hood ornament on a car being driven by a man with a bulbous nose and a very large checkbook. The seeds of the Federal Reserve were sown in the silence of that library. The bankers realized they needed a system that didn't involve being locked in a room by J.P. Morgan, and the public realized they needed a system that didn't involve giving J.P. Morgan all the steel in the country every time the stock market caught a cold. The economy is currently on life support, but it's breathing. Morgan has finished his game of solitaire, and the bankers are heading home to explain to their wives why they're suddenly part of a steel conglomerate. Chapter 3. The Invention of the Fed, the Prequel. Or How to Replace a Grumpy Billionaire with a Room Full of Purgatory. The morning after J.P. Morgan saved the United States from itself, the country woke up with a massive, pounding financial hangover. It was the kind of headache that makes you regret every decision you've made since the Louisiana Purchase. We were relieved, yes, much in the way a man is relieved to find out the tiger that was chasing him has decided to eat his neighbor instead. But underneath that relief was a simmering collective embarrassment. The United States of America, the land of the free, the home of the brave, and the self-appointed inventor of modern efficiency, had just discovered that its entire economic survival depended on whether or not a 70-year-old man with a bad nose had enjoyed his breakfast. If Morgan had woken up on the wrong side of the bed, or if his solitaire game had gone particularly poorly that morning, the American dollar would currently be worth about as much as a used cigar stub. It was a realization that didn't sit well with the national ego. We had spent a century arguing that a central bank was a tool of European tyranny, a monarchist plot to keep the common man in shackles. We had killed the first Bank of the United States and the second Bank of the United States with the righteous fury of people who preferred their financial collapses to be democratic. But after 1907, the democratic method of watching your life savings vanish into a copper-plated hole in the ground was starting to lose its charm. The Morgan contingency. The problem, as the politicians in Washington finally realized while staring blankly at their empty inkwells, was that J.P. Morgan was mortal. This was a distressing thought. Morgan's heart was undoubtedly made of solid 24-karat gold, but his arteries were unfortunately made of 19th-century steak and pure, unadulterated stress. What happens when Morgan goes to that great boardroom in the sky? Who takes over? Do we just wait for the next billionaire with a library and a deck of cards to emerge from the mists of Wall Street? The prospect of waiting for the next Morgan as a national economic policy was a bit like waiting for a lightning strike as a national energy policy. It was brilliant when it happened, but the intervals were terribly dark. Enter Senator Nelson Aldrich, the man who loved money. Into this vacuum stepped Senator Nelson Aldrich. If you were to look up the term Gilded Age politician in a dictionary, you would find a picture of Nelson Aldrich looking back at you with an expression of profound, expensive boredom. Aldrich was the general manager of the United States, a man who treated the Senate like his private social club and the American tax code like a personal suggestion box. He was so well connected to the wealthy that his daughter had married a Rockefeller. In the world of 1907, that was the equivalent of a commoner marrying a Greek god, except the Greek god had more oil and fewer scandals. Aldrich looked at the panic of 1907 and didn't see a tragedy. He saw a design flaw. He realized that the American banking system was essentially thousands of little lifeboats all floating independently with no mother ship to pick them up when the storm hit. His mission was to build that ship, but he had to do it without using the word bank because Americans hated that word, and without using the word central because Americans hated that word even more. The Aldrich-Vreeland Act, the national Band-Aid. The first attempt at a fix was the Aldrich-Vreeland Act of 1908. It was the legislative equivalent of putting a piece of chewing gum over a leak in a dam. It allowed banks to band together in national currency associations to issue emergency money during a crisis. It was a way of saying, in case of fire, please feel free to print your own fire extinguisher. But the real meat of the act was the creation of the National Monetary Commission. This was a committee of 18 men, 9 senators and 9 representatives, who were given a giant pile of taxpayer money and told to go to Europe to study how the foreigners managed to keep their banks from exploding every 20 minutes. The European Fact-Finding Mission, or the world's most expensive vacation. Aldrich and his committee spent the better part of 2 years touring the capitals of Europe. They went to London, Paris, and Berlin. They ate the finest food, drank the finest wines, and spoke with the heads of the Bank of England and the Reichsbank. It was a grueling schedule of luxury and high-level snoozing. What they discovered was horrifying to their American sensibilities. The Europeans were organized. They had central banks that could move money around like a chess master moving pieces on a board. They didn't have to wait for a private citizen to lock people in a library. They had systems. They had bureaucracy. Aldrich returned to the United States convinced that America needed a central bank. However, he also knew that if he walked onto the floor of the Senate and said, "I have a great idea from Germany," he would be lynched before he reached the podium. He needed a way to introduce a central authority that looked like it was actually decentralized. He needed a way to make a king look like a committee. The Secret of Jekyll Island, the prequel to the prequel. Now we're getting slightly ahead of our 1907 timeline, but the seeds were being watered in the damp, nervous soil of this year. The discussions began in hushed tones in the cloakrooms of Washington. Aldrich started gathering a brain trust of bankers, men from the House of Morgan and the National City Bank. They knew they couldn't do this in public. The progressives and the populists out west were already sharpening their pitchforks at the mere mention of Wall Street. So they began planning a secret meeting, a gathering so clandestine that the participants were told to use only their first names so the servants wouldn't know who they were. It was the beginning of the Jekyll Island plan, a conspiracy to save the world by making it incredibly boring. They wanted to create a system where the panic would no longer be a dramatic event involving screaming crowds and locked libraries, but rather a series of dull meetings, interest rate adjustments, and paperwork that would put a caffeinated squirrel to sleep. The legacy of 1907's lesson. The invention of the Fed was the realization that the Gilded Age had outgrown its own boots. We could no longer be a nation of rugged individualists if those individuals were constantly going bankrupt because of a copper mine in Montana. We were trading the age of the hero, Morgan, for the age of the institution, the Fed. We decided that instead of having one man with a bulbous nose and a great deal of character, we would rather have 12 regional banks and a board of governors with no discernible personality whatsoever. We traded the panic for the recession, and we traded the bailout by cigar for the bailout by committee. It was the end of an era. The Wild West of finance was being fenced in. The magic of the market was being replaced by the science of economics, a science that, as we would eventually learn, is about as accurate as predicting the weather by looking at a goat's liver, but with significantly more charts. The Fed wouldn't be officially born until 1913, but its gestation began in the cold sweat of 1907. We were finally admitting that if we wanted to be a world power, we couldn't keep running our economy like a high-stakes game of three-card Monte on a street corner. We were growing up, and as any child can tell you, growing up is mostly just a process of replacing fun, dangerous things with boring, safe ones. The bankers have stopped screaming, the senators have packed their bags for Paris, and the American people are cautiously checking their wallets to see if the money is still there. But while the money was being sorted out, Teddy Roosevelt was looking at the horizon and realizing that the United States didn't just need a stable bank, it needed a very large, very white, and very loud distraction. Chapter 4. The Great White Fleet, or How to Say I'm Not Touching You with 16,000 tons of steel. While the bankers of New York were still dusting the soot off their waistcoats and wondering if they'd ever see their gold again, President Theodore Roosevelt was suffering from a different kind of itch. You see, Teddy was a man of unrestrained exuberance, a man who lived his life as if he were perpetually being shot out of a cannon toward a very specific and usually very loud objective. By December 1907, Teddy had decided that the American people had spent quite enough time looking into their empty pockets. It was time for them to look at the horizon. And on that horizon, he intended to place the largest, whitest, and most expensive collection of floating ironmongery the world had ever seen. The diplomacy of the bludgeon. Roosevelt's foreign policy is famously summarized as speak softly and carry a big stick. It's a wonderful sentiment, though I've noticed that Teddy rarely did the first part and was obsessively preoccupied with the second. In late 1907, the Big Stick took the form of 16 battleships, manned by 14,000 sailors, and painted a shade of white so blindingly bright it was said to be visible from the moon, or at least from the nightmares of the Japanese Admiralty. The official reason for this 43,000-mile world tour was practice. The Navy claimed they simply wanted to see if they could move a fleet from the Atlantic to the Pacific without everyone drowning or getting lost. But the real reason was to remind the world, and specifically the Empire of Japan, that the United States had officially graduated from the small, plucky republic phase of its life and had entered the global superpower with a fragile ego phase. Japan had recently finished thrashing the Russians in a war that surprised everyone except the Japanese. Suddenly, they were the big kids on the Pacific playground, and they were looking at California's discriminatory school laws with an expression that suggested they might want to have a very pointed conversation about it. Roosevelt's response was not to send a polite letter, but to send 16 battleships to their front porch to deliver a friendly wave. the wedding cake navy. The first thing you must understand about the Great White Fleet is the paint. Ordinarily, battleships are painted a dull, depressing gray, the color of a rainy Tuesday in London or a banker's heart. But Teddy ordered these ships painted a brilliant, gleaming white, with gilded scroll work on the bows. It was a stroke of genius. It turned a fleet of killing machines into a peace mission. It's the military equivalent of putting a lace doily on a meat cleaver. By painting them white, Roosevelt was saying, "We aren't here to fight. We're just here for a pageant." Of course, the 16-inch guns poking out from the white paint suggested that if the pageant went poorly, the peace mission would conclude with a very loud and permanent finale. On December 16, 1907, the fleet gathered at Hampton Roads, Virginia. It was a spectacle of the highest order. The president arrived on the Mayflower, the presidential yacht, not the original. Teddy didn't have a time machine, though I'm sure he tried to commission one. He stood on the deck, his teeth gleaming as brightly as the hulls of the ships, waving his hat like a man who had just won the lottery and was buying everyone a round of naval supremacy. The small matter of the coal. As the ships prepared to weigh anchor, a small irritating technicality arose. It's the kind of detail that politicians usually ignore until it's too late. Fuel. These battleships were powered by coal, a staggering, unholy amount of coal. To sail around the world, the fleet would need to consume hundreds of thousands of tons of the stuff. The problem was that the United States didn't actually have enough coaling stations around the globe to keep the big stick moving. So, in a delicious irony that I suspect gave the British a great deal of quiet satisfaction, the United States had to hire 50 foreign collier ships, mostly British, to follow our fleet and feed it. We were essentially parading around the world to show off our independence and power, while being followed by a trail of British delivery boys without whom we would be drifting aimlessly in the middle of the Atlantic within a week. It was like a man driving a brand-new Ferrari through town, followed by a tow truck that has to stop every 5 miles to give him a gallon of gas. 14,000 sailors and the call of the sea. Inside these whitewashed hulls were 14,000 men, most of whom had joined the Navy to see the world and were about to discover that the world is mostly just different shades of blue water and the smell of hot grease. Life on a 1907 battleship was not a luxury cruise. The quarters were cramped. The food was a culinary crime involving salted pork and things that were technically biscuits, and the noise of the engines was enough to rattle the fillings out of your teeth. But as the fleet pulled away from the Virginia coast, the morale was sky high. There is something about being part of a 43,000-mile parade that makes a man feel significantly taller, even if he's sleeping in a hammock 3 inches away from a man who snores like a freight train. The fleet was led by the USS Connecticut, and as it passed the president's yacht, the sailors manned the rails, the bands played "The Girl I Left Behind Me," and the cannons fired a 21-gun salute. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated American bravado. Roosevelt watched them go until they were nothing but smudges of smoke on the horizon. He had sent them without the full permission of Congress, and he had only given them enough money to get halfway around the world. He figured that if they were stuck in the Pacific, Congress would be forced to pay to bring them back. It was a bait and switch on a continental scale. performed by a man who treated the national treasury like a personal piggy bank for his adventures. The "I'm Not Touching You" tour begins. The Great White Fleet was the ultimate exercise in diplomatic theater. It was a message to the world that the 19th century was over, and the 20th century belonged to the people with the most white lead paint and the most efficient coal shovels. As they headed south toward South America, because the Panama Canal was still just a very expensive mud pit at the time, the world began to react. The South Americans were impressed, the Europeans were annoyed, and the Japanese began to sharpen their pencils. The stage was set. The ships were white. The sailors were hopeful, and the president was grinning. We were about to find out if the world liked being patted on the head by a fleet of battleships, or if we were simply inviting everyone else to start building their own. But that is a story for the next port of call. For now, the Gilded Gulp was over, and the Great White Tourist was at sea, leaving the financial wreckage of Wall Street behind in favor of the salt spray and the uncertainty of the deep. The fleet is currently steaming south. The coal smoke is thick in the air, and the band is probably playing something patriotic and slightly out of tune. Back in Washington, Congress is looking at the bill and having a small collective stroke. Chapter 5. Japan says, "Nice boat." Or, the art of being terrified with a smile on your face. If there is one thing more awkward than being a guest in a house where you aren't wanted, it is being a guest in a house where the host has recently finished beating up the neighborhood bully and is currently sharpening a very long, very thin sword in the hallway. By the time the Great White Fleet turned its gleaming prows toward Yokohama in October 1908, the international atmosphere was thick enough to be sliced and served on a cracker. You see, the Japanese had spent the previous few years proving that the invincible European was a myth by dismantling the Russian Navy with the clinical efficiency of a butcher at a county fair. They were feeling proud, they were feeling powerful, and they were feeling particularly insulted by the fact that the United States, a country that couldn't even keep its own banks open, was currently parading 16 battleships through their backyard to see if they were intimidated. The world held its breath. The newspapers in London and Paris were practically printing the obituaries for the American sailors already, betting on which side would accidentally fire a cannon and start a war that would turn the Pacific into a very large, very salty bowl of scrap metal. The ultimate guilt trip, 50,000 school children. As the American fleet entered Tokyo Bay, Admiral Sperry and his men were prepared for anything. They expected cold stares, perhaps a few pointedly aimed coastal batteries, or at least a very stiff, formal silence. What they got instead was something far more devastating: extreme, unrelenting politeness. The Japanese government had decided that if the Americans wanted to show off their big stick, the Japanese would respond with a big bouquet. As the 16 white behemoths dropped anchor, they weren't met with warships, but with thousands upon thousands of school children. Imagine it. 50,000 Japanese children, dressed in their Sunday best, standing on the docks and along the hillsides, waving American flags and singing the Star-Spangled Banner in English. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. You cannot open fire on a fleet of singing children. You cannot even look sternly at them. The American sailors, who had spent the last several months thinking they were the toughest men on the ocean, suddenly felt like a group of uncles who had accidentally crashed a very well-organized birthday party. The Admiral Togo Stare. Among the welcoming party was Admiral Haihachiro Togo, the man who had crushed the Russians at Tsushima. Togo was a legend, a man whose presence was so commanding it was said he could sink a ship just by looking at its hull and finding a grammatical error in its blueprints. When Togo met the American officers, the diplomatic theater reached its peak. There was bowing, there was tea, there was an exchange of medals that were so shiny and numerous they probably affected the local tides. Togo looked at the American battleships, those great, white, coal-belching symbols of Roosevelt's ego, and smiled. It was the kind of smile a watchmaker gives to someone showing off a very loud, very heavy, and slightly inaccurate grandfather clock. It was a smile that said, "It is a very nice boat indeed. It's a bit bright, isn't it? And those guns, they're quite large. I suppose you need them to be large if you plan on missing the target." The Japanese officers were polite, but they were also busy. While the American sailors were being treated to endless banquets of sushi and sake, which many of the boys from Nebraska treated with the suspicion one usually reserves for alien life forms, the Japanese naval architects were discreetly taking notes. They weren't looking at the paint. They were looking at the armor belts. They were measuring the distance between the turrets. They were admiring the nice boat while mentally calculating how many torpedoes it would take to turn it into a very expensive artificial reef. The sake and the sledgehammer. For an entire week, the Americans were conquered by hospitality. There were garden parties, receptions at the Imperial Palace, and more speeches about eternal friendship than a wedding between two people who actually hate each other's families. The sailors, for their part, were having the time of their lives. After months of eating salted beef that had likely been cured during the McKinley administration, the fresh food and the exotic sights of Japan were a revelation. They bought silks, they bought fans, and they likely bought a great deal of trouble that they would later have to explain to their sweethearts back in Peoria. But the tension never truly evaporated. It just changed its state from a gas to a liquid. It was there in the way the Japanese hosts would gently ask about the speed of the USS Connecticut. It was there in the way the American officers would accidentally mention how quickly they could reload their main batteries. It was a week-long game of "I'll show you mine if you show me yours," played by two empires that both knew the Pacific wasn't big enough for two suns to rise at the same time. The farewell, a masterpiece of subtlety. When the fleet finally prepared to leave, the Japanese sent them off with even more pomp than when they arrived. There were fireworks, there were more singing children, there was enough bunting to gift-wrap the moon. As the Connecticut led the line out of the harbor, the Japanese fleet accompanied them for a short distance. It was a guard of honor, but it was also a patrol to the exit. It was the international equivalent of a bouncer walking you to the door of a club and saying, "We had a lovely time, please don't come back without an invitation." Roosevelt, back in Washington, received the cables and declared the visit a triumph of international goodwill. And in a way, he was right. He had aimed a loaded gun at Japan, and Japan had responded by putting a carnation in the barrel. Both sides could claim victory. Roosevelt had shown his fleet, and the Japanese had shown they weren't afraid of it. The lesson of Yokohama. The nice boat incident of 1908 taught the world a valuable lesson in the new century. Politeness is the most effective form of intimidation. The Japanese had realized that they didn't need to fight the Great White Fleet to defeat it. They just needed to outclass it. The American sailors left Japan with suitcases full of souvenirs and a vague sense that they had been outmaneuvered by a group of people who were infinitely more patient than they were. They had come to provide a big stick lesson to the East, and they were leaving with a deep appreciation for cherry blossoms and the unsettling realization that the Japanese Navy knew exactly how much coal they were carrying. The Pacific was calm for now, but as the white ships disappeared into the mist, the Japanese were already going back to their drawing boards. They had seen the best the Americans had to offer, and they had decided that nice wasn't going to be enough for what was coming next. The fleet is now heading toward China and the Philippines. The sailors are trying to figure out how to pack a 3-foot-tall porcelain vase into a footlocker, and Admiral Sperry is probably checking his gray hairs in the mirror. But while the Navy was playing diplomat, the politicians back in the States were busy making sure those same Japanese hosts wouldn't be allowed to live next door to them. Chapter 6. The Gentleman's Agreement, or How to Be a Bigot Without Ever Raising Your Voice. There is a specific high-altitude level of hypocrisy that can only be achieved by men wearing starched, detachable collars and 3-piece wool suits in the middle of July. We call this diplomacy, and in 1907, the finest example of this craft was the Gentleman's Agreement. Now, whenever you hear the word gentleman used in a political context, you should immediately check your pockets to ensure your wallet is still there, and then check the horizon to see if anyone is preparing to build a wall. A gentleman, in the parlance of international relations, is simply a man who has agreed to do something incredibly rude, but has promised to use a silver spoon while doing it. The San Francisco School Board's bright idea. The trouble began, as so many American headaches do, in California. San Francisco had recently been knocked down by the 1906 earthquake, and while most people were busy trying to find their chimneys or their dignity, the San Francisco Board of Education decided that what the city really needed was a good old-fashioned bout of segregation. They issued a decree stating that Japanese children who were at the time attending schools alongside everyone else must henceforth attend a separate Oriental school. They claimed it was for the sake of order, which is the word people use when they mean, I am frightened of someone who works harder than I do. The problem was that Japan in 1907 was not the Japan of 1850. They had just finished polishing the floor with the Russian Empire, and they were in no mood to be told by a group of school board officials in a half-ruined city that their children weren't fit to sit next to the offspring of a Barbary Coast saloon keeper. Tokyo was indignant. They didn't just send a letter, they sent a vibration that was felt all the way to the White House. Teddy Roosevelt, the lion in the china shop. President Theodore Roosevelt was in a bind. On one hand, he had the Californians, who were behaving with the irrational ferocity of a disturbed hornet's nest. On the other hand, he had the Japanese, who were currently holding the keys to the Pacific and looking at their battleships with a "don't tempt me" glint in their eyes. Teddy knew that he couldn't actually order San Francisco to change its laws, states' rights being the sacred cow that Americans love to worship right up until the moment it kicks them in the teeth. But he also knew that if he didn't do something, he might have a war on his hands that 16 white-painted battleships couldn't solve by merely looking pretty. So, Teddy did what any great leader does when faced with an impossible situation. He invited the troublemakers to dinner. He brought the San Francisco School Board to Washington. I imagine the scene was much like a school principal calling the bullies into his office, only the principal has a mountain lion under his desk and a Nobel Peace Prize on the wall. Roosevelt shouted, he gestured, he probably broke a few pieces of furniture, and eventually he hammered out a deal. The agreement that wasn't an agreement. The Gentlemen's Agreement of 1907 to 1908 was a masterpiece of legislative invisibility. It wasn't a treaty. It wasn't a law. It was never voted on by Congress, which meant the Senate couldn't get their greasy thumbs all over it. It was simply an informal understanding between the United States and the Empire of Japan. The terms were a study in refined cruelty. Japan agreed to stop issuing passports to laborers who wanted to go to the United States. They essentially volunteered to become their own border patrol. The United States, by which we mean TR, leaning heavily on the neck of California, agreed to stop the segregation of Japanese children in San Francisco schools. It was a trade. Japan would stop sending people, and America would stop being quite so loud about how much they didn't want them. It was the international equivalent of saying, I won't kick you out of the party if you promise to stop coming to the party. The picture bride loophole. However, because it was a gentleman's agreement, it had the structural integrity of a Swiss cheese sandwich. The agreement said that laborers couldn't come, but it allowed for the wives and children of Japanese men already in America to join them. This led to the fascinating and somewhat heartbreaking phenomenon of the picture bride. Thousands of young Japanese women would exchange photographs with men they had never met, marry them by proxy in Japan, and then board a ship for San Francisco or Hawaii. When they arrived, they often discovered that the prosperous landowner in the photograph was actually a man who lived in a shack and picked strawberries for 12 hours a day. But they stayed, they worked, they built lives. The gentlemen in Washington and Tokyo had tried to stop the tide of humanity with a handshake, but they had forgotten that people are significantly more resourceful than politicians. The refined odor of bigotry. What makes the Gentlemen's Agreement so refined is that it allowed everyone to save face while still being thoroughly wretched. The Americans could say they weren't being racist because they hadn't passed an Exclusion Act, like they had with the Chinese in 1882. The Japanese could say they weren't being insulted because they were the ones choosing to limit their own immigration. It was a lie wrapped in a bow. It was a gentleman's agreement, because only men who have never had to pick a strawberry in their lives could make something so ugly sound so much like a tea party. It also set a dangerous precedent. It taught the world that the United States was a place where all men are created equal, provided those men didn't come from a country with too much sun in its flag. It was the birth of a specific kind of American exclusionism, the kind that doesn't use a club but rather a very polite, very firm no. The ghost in the machine. By 1908, The schools in San Francisco were integrated again, the Japanese passports had slowed to a trickle, and the big stick was still out at sea, blissfully unaware that the diplomats had already surrendered the moral high ground. Roosevelt was proud of himself. He had avoided a war, silenced the Californians, and kept the Japanese at arm's length. But the gentleman's agreement was a ghost that would haunt the Pacific for the next 40 years. It left a residue of resentment in Japan that no amount of white paint on a battleship could ever cover up. It told a rising power that they were almost equal, but not quite. And there is nothing more dangerous than telling a proud man he is allowed in the house, but only through the servants' entrance. We had traded a crisis for a grudge. We had exchanged a loud argument for a silent, simmering anger. But in the world of 1907, that was considered a success. As long as the gentlemen were happy, the rest of the world could simply learn to live with the consequences. The ink on the non-existent agreement is dry. The school children are back in their desks, and Teddy Roosevelt is likely looking for something else to shout at. But while we were busy drawing invisible lines across the Pacific, a man in a lab in New York was about to invent a way to make sure those lines stayed put forever by making them out of plastic. Chapter 7. Bailout, the birth of the unbreakable, or how humanity finally created something that will outlive its own common sense. If there is one thing the Creator did with remarkable efficiency, it was ensuring that everything eventually goes back to the dirt. Trees rot, iron rusts, empires crumble, and even the most stubborn of mother-in-laws eventually yields to the passage of time. For several thousand years, humanity lived in a world where, if you dropped something, it either shattered or it decomposed. It was a fair arrangement. If you made a mess, nature eventually sent a committee of bacteria to come and tidy it up for you. But in 1907, a Belgian-American chemist named Leo Baekeland decided that nature was being a bit too lazy with her cleanup duties. He decided that what the world really needed was a substance that would survive a fire, ignore a lightning bolt, and potentially outlast the very sun itself. He gave us Bailout, the first fully synthetic plastic, and in doing so, he ensured that 10,000 years from now, when archaeologists are digging up the ruins of our civilization, they won't find our wisdom or our poetry. They will find a perfectly preserved radio knob and a billiard ball that still looks like it's waiting for its turn at the table. The shellac crisis and the bug spit economy. To understand the genius of Leo Baekeland, you must first understand the disgusting reality of the 19th century insulation market. Before plastic, if you wanted to coat an electrical wire so it didn't set your house on fire, you needed shellac. And where does shellac come from? It is the refined excrement of the female Laccifer lacca, a tiny bug in Southeast Asia that spends its life sucking on tree sap, and then, to put it delicately, varnishing the branches with its own digestive leftovers. It took roughly 15,000 bugs 6 months to produce enough lassie to make a single pound of shellac. By 1907, with the world suddenly deciding it wanted electric lights, telephones, and phonographs in every room, the poor Laccifer lacca was suffering from a workload that would have made a Victorian chimney sweep weep with exhaustion. The price of bug spit was skyrocketing. The world was desperate for a substitute, something that didn't require an army of insects, to go through a digestive crisis every time someone wanted to listen to a Sousa march on their gramophone. The witch's brew, phenol, and formaldehyde. Leo Baekeland was already a wealthy man, having invented a type of photographic paper that allowed him to sell his soul to George Eastman for a tidy sum. But he wasn't done. He retreated to his laboratory in Yonkers, a place that I imagine smelled like a mix between a hospital wing and a hardware store fire, and began mixing two of the most unpleasant substances known to man, phenol and formaldehyde. Phenol is a caustic acid that smells like a damp cellar and can eat through a man's skin if he looks at it too sternly. Formaldehyde is the stuff they use to keep dead people looking presentable for the viewing. It is not the kind of magic recipe one usually associates with progress. It sounds more like the beginning of a Gothic novel, where the protagonist ends up with an extra limb. Baekeland's breakthrough was discovering that if you combine these two poisons under immense heat and pressure, they didn't just explode or sit there looking sullen. They underwent a polymeric transformation. They shook hands, locked fingers, and became a resin that was harder than mahogany and more stubborn than a mule. The Bakeliter, the pressure cooker from the inferno. To create this material of 1,000 uses, Baekeland invented a machine he called the Bakeliter. It was a massive iron pressure cooker that looked like a deep-sea diving bell or a very aggressive tea kettle. He would pour in his chemical soup, crank up the heat to 300 degrees, and apply pressure until the molecules had no choice but to surrender and become a solid. What emerged from the Bakeliter was a dark, lustrous substance that was utterly indifferent to the world around it. You could boil it in water, and it wouldn't soften. You could dip it in acid, and it wouldn't dissolve. You could pass 10,000 volts of electricity through it, and it would just sit there, unimpressed. He called it Bakelite because Baekeland resin didn't have quite the same ring to it, and the indestructible goo of Yonkers was rejected by the marketing department. The elephant's great relief. One of the first and most noble uses of Bakelite was in the world of billiards. For decades, billiard balls were made of ivory. This meant that every time a gentleman in a velvet jacket wanted to play a game of 8-ball, an elephant in Africa had to lose its tusks. It was a terribly lopsided trade, and as the popularity of the game grew, the elephant population began to look at pool halls with the same dread a turkey feels for Thanksgiving. The billiard industry had offered a $10,000 prize for a substitute for ivory. They had tried celluloid, an earlier semi-synthetic, but it had a nasty habit of being highly flammable. There are documented accounts of billiard balls occasionally exploding when they hit each other too hard, which certainly added a level of excitement to the game, but was generally frowned upon by the players who preferred to keep their eyebrows. Bakelite, however, was the perfect substitute. It was dense, it was smooth, and it was decidedly non-explosive. The elephants of the world collectively exhaled a sigh of relief that could be heard across the Serengeti. We had finally stopped killing sentient giants for the sake of our leisure, and instead we started using the magic resin from the pressure cooker. The dawn of the plastic age. By the end of 1907, the floodgates were open. Bakelite began appearing everywhere. It was in the handles of hairbrushes, the casings of telephones, the steering wheels of cars, and the buttons on the very coats of the men who were busy buying the stuff. Bakeland advertised it as the material of 1,000 uses, and for once, a salesman wasn't lying. It made the 20th century possible. Without Bakelite's insulating properties, our electrical grid would have been a tangled mess of charred wires and disappointed homeowners. It gave us the modern look, sleek, hard, and shiny. But there was a catch, a cosmic irony that we're only now starting to appreciate in 2026. Because Bakelite was unbreakable and unmeltable, it was also unerasable. Nature looked at Bakelite and realized she had no tools in her kit to deal with it. The bacteria took one sniff of the phenol formaldehyde cocktail and decided they'd rather eat a rock. The permanence of the trivial. We had achieved the alchemist's dream of creating something permanent, but we had used that power to create radio knobs and fountain pen barrels. We had invented a substance that will last for 1,000,000 years, and we used it to make trinkets that we would throw away in tin. Bakelite was the precursor to the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, the great-grandfather of the plastic straw, and the silent witness to our obsession with convenience. In 1907, it was a miracle. It was the triumph of man over the imperfections of nature. We were no longer beholden to the bug or the elephant. We were the masters of the synthetic. But as I look back from the vantage point of history, I can't help but wonder if Leo Bakeland realized that he hadn't just invented a new material. He had invented a new kind of immortality, the kind that sits in a landfill forever, gleaming in the dark, waiting for a civilization that actually knows what to do with it. The Bakelizer is currently cooling down, and the world is suddenly feeling a lot smoother and more resinous. But while we were learning to make everything out of synthetic goop, the Atlantic Ocean was about to be conquered by a different kind of marvel, one made of steel, silk, and a truly reckless amount of confidence. Chapter 8. The Lusitania's Maiden Voyage, or How to Challenge the Atlantic with a Potted Palm and 4 Propellers. By September 1907, the British had reached a conclusion that they had been harboring for several decades. The Atlantic Ocean was not so much a vast, terrifying expanse of salt water as it was a slightly inconvenient puddle that simply needed to be crossed with more velvet and higher speeds. The Cunard Line, backed by a very large pile of British government gold, decided that the only way to humble the Germans, who were currently building very fast ships with very long names, was to build a floating city that moved with the velocity of a startled cat and the elegance of a Buckingham Palace ballroom. Thus, they gave us the RMS Lusitania. She was, at the time, the fastest, largest, and most opulent object ever moved by the hand of man. She was 787 feet of arrogance, steel, and Edwardian woodwork, and she was launched with the absolute certainty that the 20th century was going to be a very fast, very comfortable affair. The Cult of the Unsinkable. It was during this period that the word unsinkable began to be tossed around the shipyards of the Clyde with a frequency that would make a theologian nervous. Now, I have noticed that the universe has a very specific sense of humor when it comes to adjectives. The moment a man points at a piece of hardware and declares it invincible, unbreakable, or waterproof, the universe immediately begins checking its schedule to see when it can arrange a catastrophic correction. The Lusitania was divided into 17 watertight compartments. It was said that she could float with any two of them flooded, which is a bit like saying a man can live with only half a brain. It's technically possible, but you wouldn't want to bet your life on his ability to do long division. This engineering bravado gave the traveling public a sense of security that was, in hindsight, perhaps a bit premature. It turned the crossing of the North Atlantic, a body of water known for its mood swings and occasional icebergs, into a casual afternoon stroll, provided the stroll involved 6 courses of French cuisine and a string quartet. Parsons and the Power of Steam. The real secret of the Lusitania wasn't her marble fireplaces or her silk tapestries, it was her heart. She was the first great liner to be powered by Parsons steam turbines. Before the turbine, ships were powered by reciprocating engines, massive, thumping iron monsters that shook the teeth out of the passengers' heads every time the pistons moved. A trip across the ocean in an old-fashioned liner was a bit like being trapped inside a very loud, very wet clock. But the turbine was different. It didn't thump. It hummed. It was a smooth, high-pitched whistle of power that turned 4 massive propellers with a force of 76,000 horses. This allowed the Lusitania to maintain a speed of 25 knots. To the modern ear, 25 knots sounds like the speed of a particularly sluggish golf cart. But in 1907, it was the speed of the future. It meant you could leave Liverpool on Saturday and be in New York in time for a late lunch on Thursday. We were finally outrunning the horizon. A palace with a propeller. If you were wealthy enough to afford a first-class ticket, a sum that would currently buy you a very nice motor car or a small island, the Lusitania was less of a ship and more of a hallucination. The dining saloon was 2 stories high, topped with a plaster dome painted with scenes that suggested the ocean was a much friendlier place than it actually is. There were elevators, an absolute novelty at sea, which allowed the better sort to travel between decks without the indignity of using their own legs. There were smoking rooms paneled in mahogany, a lounge designed to look like the Palace of Versailles, and enough potted palms to start a small jungle. The message was clear. You are not at sea. You are in a grand hotel that just happens to be moving at 30 miles per hour over a 3-mile-deep abyss. The windows were draped in heavy silks to prevent the passengers from accidentally seeing the waves, which were considered vulgar and unrefined. The view from the 3rd class. Of course, for every gentleman sipping sherry in the lounge, there were 10 people in 3rd class, or steerage, who were packed into the lower decks like sardines in a tin. But even for them, 1907 was a year of progress. Cunard had realized that if you treat the immigrants slightly better than livestock, they are more likely to survive the trip and recommend your line to their cousins back in the old country. The Lusitania's 3rd class offered something revolutionary, running water and electric lights. To a peasant from the Russian steppes or a laborer from the Irish Midlands, the Lusitania was the most technological marvel they had ever encountered. They were traveling to a new world in a ship that had more electricity than their entire home village. It was the Gilded Age in miniature, gold on top, steel in the middle, and a great deal of hopeful humanity in the basement. The Maiden Voyage, September 7th, 1907. When the Lusitania pulled away from the docks at Liverpool, the crowd was so dense It was a wonder the island didn't tip over. It was a moment of supreme national pride. The British were proving that while the Americans had the money and the Germans had the ambition, the British still had the greatest ship. She steamed across the Atlantic, her four funnels belching enough black coal smoke to darken a small moon, and she arrived in New York to a hero's welcome. She didn't break the speed record, the blue riband, on her first try, mostly because the engines were still settling in, but she did it on her second trip. She shaved hours off the world's schedule. She made the world smaller, louder, and significantly more expensive. The challenge to the Almighty. Looking back at the Lusitania in 1907, she represents the pinnacle of a very specific kind of human delusion. We believed that we had finally mastered the elements. We had Bakelite to insulate our wires, J.P. Morgan to settle our debts, and the Lusitania to conquer our oceans. We were so convinced of our own cleverness that we began to treat the North Atlantic as a private lake. We assumed that speed was a substitute for caution and that luxury was a shield against the unexpected. The Lusitania was a magnificent achievement, but she was also a direct challenge to the gods of the sea, a challenge that, as we know, would eventually be answered with a torpedo in 1915. But in 1907, war was a distant rumor, and the unsinkable was a fact. The Lusitania was the queen of the waves, and as she sat in New York Harbor, her white and black hull gleaming in the sun, she was the ultimate symbol of a year that thought it had solved all of life's problems with a turbine and a velvet curtain. The Lusitania is currently tied up at Pier 54. The passengers are disembarking with their trunks full of Parisian lace, and the crew is busy shoveling more coal for the return trip. But while we were mastering the high seas, the American housewife was about to meet a different kind of lightning-powered monster in her own kitchen. Chapter 9. The First Electric Washing Machine, the Thor. Or, how to use lightning to scour a shirt and occasionally reanimate the laundress. For several thousand years, the removal of dirt from a garment was a process that relied heavily on three things: a river, a very hard rock, and the sheer unadulterated resentment of the person doing the scrubbing. It was a primitive arrangement, but it was honest. You pounded the fabric against the stone until either the dirt gave up or the shirt disintegrated. By the 19th century, we had progressed to the washboard, a device designed by someone who clearly hated human knuckles and felt that the skin on a woman's hands was a luxury she didn't truly deserve. But then came 1907. It was a year, as we have seen, where humanity decided that if a task was worth doing, it was worth doing with a motor, a belt, and a terrifying amount of unshielded electricity. Thus, the Hurley Machine Company of Chicago unleashed upon the unsuspecting American household the Thor, the world's first electric washing machine. The god of thunder in the scullery. I must pause to admire the naming of this contraption. To name a laundry bucket after the Norse god of thunder, lightning, and war is a piece of marketing bravado that borders on the prophetic. Thor was known for wielding a hammer and smashing things. The 1907 washing machine was known for wielding a wooden drum and occasionally smashing the person standing next to it with a stray electrical current. Invented by a man named Alva J. Fisher, the Thor was not what you would call a sleek appliance. It did not hum quietly in the corner of a laundry room. It sat in the middle of the kitchen like a galvanized steel and wood monstrosity that looked as though it had been salvaged from the wreckage of a locomotive. It consisted of a large wooden drum that rotated inside a metal tub. It was powered by an electric motor that sat, quite naked and shivering, underneath the tub. The thrill of the open motor. Now, a modern engineer, a person who has been ruined by safety regulations and lawsuits, would tell you that placing an open, unshielded electric motor directly beneath a large vat of soapy water is a recipe for a funeral. But in 1907, we didn't have safety regulations. We had character. The motor of the Thor was exposed to the elements. If the tub leaked, and in 1907 things leaked as a matter of professional pride, the water would drip directly onto the sparking, whirring electrical components. This turned the simple act of washing a pair of trousers into a high-stakes game of operation. Every time the laundress reached for the handle, there was a non-zero chance she would receive a 110-volt invigoration that would cause her hair to stand on end and her ancestors to flash before her eyes. It was said that the Thor took the drudgery out of wash day. I suppose that's true. It's very hard to feel bored when you are consciously wondering if the next rinse cycle will involve a bolt of artificial lightning. The agitator and the agitation. The Thor worked on a principle of reversing rotation. It would spin the clothes one way, then stop with a groan that sounded like a dying walrus, and spin them the other way. This was supposed to mimic the action of human hands, provided those hands were made of oak and possessed the strength of a steam engine. The noise was spectacular. When the Thor was in full swing, the entire house would vibrate. The china in the cupboard would dance. The cat would hide under the floorboards, and the neighbors would assume you were either building a submarine or attempting to communicate with Mars. It was a labor-saving device that required the constant supervision of a person with the steady nerves of a bomb disposal expert. And then there was the wringer. Oh, the wringer. To dry the clothes, you had to feed them through two pressurized wooden rollers at the top of the machine. It was a marvelous invention for removing water, and an even better one for removing buttons, zippers, and the occasional finger. The wringer didn't care what it was squeezing. It was an equal opportunity crusher. The myth of the saved hour. The great promise of the 20th century was that machines like the Thor would free the woman from the shackles of domesticity. We were told that the washing machine would save hours of labor, leaving the housewife free to read poetry, study the sciences, or perhaps just sit in a darkened room and marvel at her own leisure. However, I have observed a curious law of human nature. Whenever a machine saves a man an hour, the world immediately invents a new task that takes two. Before the washing machine, people wore their clothes until they were practically sentient. You didn't wash a shirt just because you'd sat in it for 20 minutes. No, you washed it because it had begun to develop its own political opinions. But once the Thor made washing easy, the standards of cleanliness skyrocketed. Suddenly, a speck of dust was a crisis. A slightly wrinkled collar was a sign of moral decay. We didn't use the saved time to rest. We used it to wash more things, more often, until we were just as tired as we were with the washboard, only now we were tired and our electric bill was higher. The electrification of the mundane. The Thor was the vanguard of a domestic invasion. In 1907, Electricity was still a novelty in most homes, a luxury used primarily for light bulbs that gave off the dim, sickly glow of a depressed firefly. But the washing machine proved that lightning could be harnessed for the trivial. If we could use it to wash a sock, what else could we do? We began to dream of electric toasters that would char bread with scientific precision, and electric vacuum cleaners that would suck the dust out of the rugs and the peace out of the afternoon. We were inviting the Thor into every room of the house, replacing the quiet manual rhythms of the 19th century with the persistent mechanical hum of the 20th. We were becoming a civilization that couldn't perform a basic function without plugging it into a wall. We were trading our muscles for motors and our silence for the rattle of the wooden drum. The verdict on the god of thunder. The Thor was a messy, dangerous, loud, and brilliant success. It was the first step toward a world where wash day didn't exist because every day was wash day. It was the bridge between the rock and the river and the gleaming white boxes of the future. Leo Baekeland gave us the plastic to make the knobs. J.P. Morgan gave us the bank to buy the machine. And Alva J. Fisher gave us the machine to make sure we never had a moment's peace again. 1907 was truly a banner year for the progress that leaves you exhausted. As the Thor chugged along in the basements of Chicago and New York, it sang a song of the new century, a song of gears, grease, and the occasional electrical pop. It was the sound of the old world being scrubbed away and the new permanent world being rinsed in a galvanized tub. The laundry is currently being fed through the wringer. The circuit breaker is humming with a faint smell of ozone, and the shirts are cleaner than they have any right to be. But while the American home was being electrified, the American border was being overwhelmed by a human tide that didn't care about electric washing machines. They just wanted a chance to stand on the shore. Chapter 10. Peak Ellis Island, or the year the Golden Door nearly came off its hinges. If you have ever stood in a line at the post office behind a man who is trying to mail a live beehive to Nebraska, you have a very faint, very polite inkling of what New York Harbor felt like in 1907. But to truly understand the scale of it, you would have to multiply that frustration by about 1 million, add the scent of 3,000 unwashed wool coats, and set the whole thing on a small patch of dirt in the shadow of a giant copper lady, who is holding a torch but offering very little in the way of actual directions. 1907 was the year that the great American experiment decided to see just how much humanity it could cram into one room before the floorboards gave way. It was the year of the peak. More than 1.2 million people passed through the gates of Ellis Island in these 12 months alone, a human tide so vast and so persistent that it would have made Moses look at the Red Sea and decide to take the bus instead. The Great Human Squeeze. For decades, the United States had been sending out help-wanted posters to the rest of the world, usually in the form of letters from cousins who claimed that the streets of Chicago were paved with gold and that the local squirrels spoke 3 languages. By 1907, the world had finally taken us at our word. They came from the fjords of Norway, the shtetls of Russia, the olive groves of Italy, and the volcanic slopes of Sicily. They arrived on the great liners, the very same ships like the Lusitania we discussed earlier, though these passengers weren't sipping sherry in the lounge. They were packed into the steerage decks, dreaming of a country where supposedly a man could become a king, or at least a man who owned 2 pairs of shoes. When the ships arrived in New York, the first and second class passengers were checked on board and allowed to skip off into the city to begin their new lives of leisure. But for the huddled masses, the journey was just beginning. They were loaded onto barges and ferried to Ellis Island, a place that managed to be simultaneously the most hopeful and the most terrifying patch of land on the planet. The 6-second medical and the dreaded button hook. The Great Hall of Ellis Island in 1907 was a masterpiece of organized chaos. It was a cathedral of noise, a cacophony of 40 different languages, all asking the same question: what happens now? What happened now was the 6-second physical. The doctors at Ellis Island had become so proficient at spotting human frailty that they could diagnose a man with a heart murmur from across the room while simultaneously eating a ham sandwich. As the immigrants shuffled up the stairs, the doctors watched for limps, for shortness of breath, or for that specific haunted look in the eyes that suggested a person might be feeble-minded, a term the government used for anyone who looked confused by the fact that they were in a giant room in New York being stared at by a man with a clipboard. Then came the button hook, to check for trachoma, a contagious eye disease that was an automatic ticket back to Europe. The doctors would use a small metal tool to flip the eyelid inside out. It was a process that was exactly as pleasant as it sounds. If you passed, you got a chalk mark on your coat. If you failed, you were pulled aside for further inspection, a word that has never, in the history of the English language, led to a fun afternoon. The 29 questions. If your eyelids and your heart were deemed sufficiently sturdy, you moved on to the legal inspectors. Here, you were asked 29 questions designed to determine if you were a criminal, a polygamist, or, worst of all, an anarchist. Do you have a job waiting for you? If you said yes, you were deported for violating the contract labor law. Do you have any money? If you said no, you were deported for being a likely public charge. It was a delicate dance of honesty and creative fiction. The inspectors wanted to make sure you weren't a burden, but they also didn't want you taking a job away from a real American, a term used by people whose ancestors had arrived a staggering 20 years earlier. And then there is the great myth of the name change. We've all heard the stories of Vito Andolini becoming Vito Corleone because an inspector couldn't spell. In reality, the inspectors worked from the ship's manifests, which were written at the port of departure. If your name was changed, it usually happened because your cousin in Brooklyn told you that Smith sounded more patriotic than Papadopoulos, or because you were trying to hide from a landlord in Warsaw who still wanted his rent. The nativist nervous breakdown. While this million-person parade was marching through the Great Hall, the people already living in America were having what can only be described as a collective nervous breakdown. The old immigrants, the English, the Germans, and the Irish, looked at the new immigrants, the Jews, the Italians, and the Slavs, with a suspicion that bordered on the comical. They were terrified that these newcomers would lower the tone of the neighborhood, work for lower wages, and introduce dangerous foreign concepts like garlic and organized labor. The newspapers were full of dire warnings about the dilution of the American spirit. Senators stood on the floor of Congress and gave speeches about the great race being overwhelmed by the tide of the unwashed. It is a curious thing about America. We are a nation that prides itself on being a melting pot. But we spend a great deal of time trying to turn down the heat the moment anyone new jumps in. The stairs of separation. At the end of the process lay the stairs of separation. There were 3 sets of stairs. One led to the ferry to Manhattan, the promised land. One led to the railroad ticket office, the great unknown. And the middle one led to the detention pen, the way back. For the vast majority, about 98%, the island was a gateway. For the other 2%, it was the island of tears. Imagine traveling 3,000 miles in a floating tin can, surviving the button hook and the 29 questions, only to be told that your 3-year-old daughter has a cough and you must all go back to a country that doesn't want you. But for the 1.2 million who made it through in 1907, the world was suddenly, terrifyingly wide. They walked off the ferry at the Battery, clutching their cardboard suitcases and their dreams, and they disappeared into the tenements of the Lower East Side, the coal mines of Pennsylvania, and the steel mills of Pittsburgh. The legacy of the million. The 1907 influx changed the DNA of the country. It turned New York into the largest Jewish city in the world, the largest Italian city in the world, and a place where you could hear every language under the sun just by walking 3 blocks. We complain about the chaos of immigration, but the truth is that those 1.2 million people were the fuel for the 20th century. They were the ones who would build the skyscrapers, dig the subways, and within a generation, produce the scientists, artists, and politicians who would make the Gilded Age look like a warm-up act. They arrived with nothing but their magic resin Bakelite buttons and their hope, and they proved that the American dream isn't a destination. It's a process of surviving a doctor with a button hook and finding a place to sleep where the squirrels don't speak Polish. The ferries are still running. The Great Hall is still echoing with 1 million different prayers. And the new Americans are currently trying to figure out how to pay rent in a city that never sleeps and rarely lowers its prices. But while the coast was being flooded with people, the interior of the country was being cleaned up in a very different way. Chapter 11. Oklahoma, the 46th star. Or how to turn a sovereign nation into a land office and a kickoff. The United States has always had a peculiar relationship with the map. We treat the geography of our continent like a messy bedroom that the federal government is perpetually trying to organize by shoving everything under the rug. For decades, that rug was a vast, wind-swept expanse of prairie known as the Indian Territory. It was the place where we sent every tribe that had the misfortune of living on land a white man wanted to farm, build a railroad through, or simply stare at with an acquisitive glint in his eye. But by 1907, the government looked at the map and realized that the rug was full. Not only was it full of people who had been promised the land as long as the grass grows and the water runs, 2 things that, incidentally, the government has always been quite poor at measuring, but it was also full of something far more important than promises: oil. And so on November 16, 1907, the Indian Territory was officially erased with a bureaucratic flourish, and Oklahoma was born as the 46th star in the flag. It was a masterpiece of progress, the kind of progress that involves rebranding 1,000 years of history as a new opportunity and then immediately charging people for the privilege of standing on it. The shotgun wedding of the century. The birth of Oklahoma was not a simple labor. It was a forced marriage. You see, there were actually two territories: Oklahoma Territory, the western half, which had been opened to white settlers via the remarkably literal land runs, and Indian Territory, the eastern half, home to the 5 civilized tribes. The people in the Indian Territory, quite sensibly, wanted to form their own state, to be called Sequoia. They drafted a constitution, held a convention, and sent a polite request to Washington. But Washington, which has never been particularly fond of competition, looked at the prospect of an Indian-led state and suffered a collective bout of selective deafness. Instead, they decided to mash the two territories together into a single, giant rectangular compromise. To celebrate this union, they held a symbolic wedding ceremony in Guthrie. A woman representing the Indian Territory was married to a man representing Oklahoma Territory. It was a lovely display of diplomatic theater, though I couldn't help but notice that the groom seemed to be doing all the talking and had his hand firmly on the bride's jewelry box. The land run, the world's most honest foot race. To understand the soul of Oklahoma, you must understand the land run. Before statehood, the government would periodically announce that a chunk of land was open, and thousands of people would line up on the border with horses, wagons, bicycles, and, in several documented cases, their own 2 legs. When the cannon fired, they would sprint into the distance to claim a piece of dirt by sticking a stake in it. It was the most honest depiction of the American spirit ever devised, a chaotic, violent, dusty scramble to get something for nothing. It was also the birth of the Sooner. A Sooner was a person who realized that sprinting was difficult and that it was much easier to simply sneak across the line the night before and hide in a creek bed until the cannon went off. In most countries, we call this trespassing or fraud. In Oklahoma, we call it getting a head start, and we eventually named a football team after it. It is a rare and beautiful thing to see a state so proud of its history of cheating that it puts it on a jersey. The Black Gush, the Glenpool Miracle. Just as the ink was drying on the statehood papers, a gentleman in a town called Tulsa discovered that if you poked a hole in the ground, the earth would occasionally spit black, flammable soup at you with the force of an angry god. The Glenpool oil strike turned Oklahoma from a farming outpost into the oil capital of the world, practically overnight. Suddenly, the land that had been given to the tribes because it was thought to be worthless was the most valuable real estate on the planet. This led to a very efficient, very American rebranding. We stopped talking about sovereignty and started talking about mineral rights. The Gilded Age had finally found its lubricant. Small towns that had consisted of 3 goats and a post office were suddenly transformed into boom towns full of millionaires, roughnecks, and people who sold medicinal whiskey out of the back of a wagon. It was a carnival of greed, powered by the prehistoric remains of dinosaurs who never could have imagined their final purpose would be to fund a skyscraper in Tulsa. The new religion, football and oil rights. With statehood came the need for civilization, which in the early 20th century meant 2 things: politics and sports. The first legislature of Oklahoma was a magnificent collection of characters who spent their time arguing about whether the state capital should be in Guthrie or Oklahoma City. They eventually solved the problem by literally stealing the state seal in the middle of the night and moving it to Oklahoma City, a move of such breathtaking audacity that I can't help but admire it. But while the politicians were arguing about seals, the public was discovering a new way to channel their aggression: American football. The University of Oklahoma had been playing since the late 1800s, but with statehood, the rivalry became a matter of national identity. Football was the perfect sport for the new state. It involved land acquisition, physical violence, and the constant threat of a Sooner sneaking past the line when the referee wasn't looking. It turned a vast expanse of history into a place where people argued about oil rights on weekdays and the forward pass on Saturdays. Progress, it seems, is nothing if not efficient at replacing deep, ancient conflicts with loud, entertaining ones. The 46th star and the closing of the frontier. As the 46th star was stitched onto the flag, the frontier was officially declared dead. The Indian Territory was gone, replaced by a grid of counties, towns, and oil derricks. We had managed to turn the Great Plains into a giant, profitable ledger. It was a triumph of the 20th century mind. We had taken a complex, multi-layered human history and flattened it into a state constitution. We had replaced the buffalo with the pump jack and the tribal council with the board of regents. Oklahoma was the first truly modern state, born in the age of the telephone, the automobile, and the corporation. It was a place built on the hustle of the land run and the luck of the oil strike. It was a land where everyone was from somewhere else, and everyone was looking for the next big thing. As 1907 drew to a close, Oklahoma stood as a testament to the American ability to reinvent itself. We had closed the book on the 19th century and opened a new one, written in oil and bound in red clay. The Indians were still there, of course, but they were now citizens, a word that allowed the government to stop making treaties and start making tax assessments. It was a much cleaner arrangement for everyone involved, provided everyone didn't include the people who were there first. The 46th star is now shining brightly on the flag. The oil derricks are pumping like the heart of a giant, and the Sooners are already planning their next victory. But while the West was being settled into a state, the South was deciding that the real enemy of progress wasn't the frontier. It was the jug. Chapter 12. Prohibition in Georgia. Or How to Make a Man's Thirst a Matter of State Security. In the long and varied history of human error, there is one particular delusion that reappears with the stubbornness of a bad penny: the belief that you can improve a man's soul by making it illegal for him to wet his whistle. In 1907, the state of Georgia, a place known for its heat, its peaches, and a historical fondness for corn-based distillations, decided it was going to lead the way into a new, parched utopia. They passed a statewide prohibition law, effective the first day of 1908, essentially declaring that while the spirit might be willing, the spirits were now a felony. It was a bold experiment in sobriety that would, in the end, mostly result in a sudden and dramatic increase in the state's population of blind tigers, locker clubs, and pharmacists who couldn't tell a fever from a Friday night craving. The moral high ground with a flask in the boot. The movement to make Georgia dry was a curious cocktail of religious fervor, social reform, and, because it was the South in 1907, a heavy dash of racial anxiety. The proponents of the bill argued that alcohol was the root of all evil, the cause of every crime, and the reason the local economy wasn't currently outperforming the British Empire. They painted a picture of a Georgia where the jails would be empty, the churches would be full, and the children would all have shiny shoes because their fathers weren't spending the rent at the saloon. However, as I have observed in my travels, the men who shout the loudest for the closing of the saloon are often the same men who have a very well-stocked cellar at home. The law was designed to target the public drinking of the laboring classes, while leaving a very comfortable, very polite loophole for the gentlemen of the state. It was a gentleman's prohibition, which is much like a gentleman's diet, where you only eat cake when nobody is looking. The blind tiger and the art of the loophole. The moment the law was signed by Governor Hoke Smith, the ingenuity of the Georgian mind went into overdrive. If a man is told he cannot have a drink, his primary occupation in life immediately becomes the acquisition of that drink. The most famous result was the Blind Tiger. This was a charmingly named establishment where, technically, you weren't paying for whiskey. You were paying a nickel to see a blind tiger, or some other curious beast, kept in the back room. The drink was merely a complimentary gift that came with the admission price. It turns out that Georgia, in 1907, was suddenly home to the most viewed yet least described menagerie of invisible felines in the history of biology. Then there were the locker clubs. These were private clubs where members could store their own alcohol in private lockers. Since the law prohibited the sale of liquor, but not the possession of it, these clubs became the social centers of every major city. It was a marvelous system. You didn't buy a drink from the bartender, you simply asked him to fetch a bottle of your private stock, which by a miraculous coincidence looked and tasted exactly like the private stock of the other 500 members. The medical miracle. Perhaps the most sudden and profound shift in the Georgian landscape was the transformation of the neighborhood drugstore. Under the law, alcohol could still be sold for medicinal purposes. Within 24 hours of the bill's passage, the state of Georgia suffered the most catastrophic health crisis in its history. Suddenly, every man, woman, and child in the state was afflicted with general malaise, vapors, nervous twitching, or a heavy heart. And the only known cure, according to a sudden surge of very busy doctors, was a pint of spiritus frumenti, otherwise known as bourbon. The pharmacies of Atlanta and Savannah became the most popular destinations in the South. A man would walk in looking as though he were on his deathbed, present a scrawled note from his physician, and walk out 5 minutes later with a spring in his step and a brown paper bag under his arm. The near beer and the far cry. To satisfy the public's thirst without actually violating the letter of the law, brewers began producing something called near beer. This was a beverage that looked like beer, smelled like beer, and was served in a glass like beer, but possessed an alcohol content so low that a man could drink a bathtub full of it and still be sober enough to balance his checkbook while standing on one leg. It was, as the name suggests, near beer, in the same way that a cardboard cutout is near a human being. It was a beverage of deep spiritual disappointment. It tasted like the tears of a man who had forgotten where he hid his jug. But it allowed the saloons to stay open as soft drink parlors, keeping the social structures of the town alive while the patrons waited for the blind tiger to open his cage. The prohibition of the mind. The great irony of the Georgia Prohibition of 1907 was that it didn't actually stop anyone from drinking. It simply made them much more creative and significantly more dishonest about it. It turned the average citizen into a conspirator and the local policeman into a man who spent most of his shift looking in the other direction. It also highlighted the great American hypocrisy, the belief that we can solve a complex human problem by simply declaring it illegal. We think that if we write a law, the human heart will suddenly stop wanting what it wants. But a man's thirst is not a legislative matter. It is a biological one. By trying to ban the jug, the state of Georgia didn't create a more moral society. It simply created a society where everyone was an actor in a very long, very dry, and very poorly written play. The dry experiment in Georgia was the dress rehearsal for the national tragedy that would follow a decade later. It proved that if you take away a man's beer, he won't start reading the Bible. He'll just start looking for a way to turn his bathtub into a distillery. The verdict of the jug. As 1907 turned into 1908, the bars were boarded up, the near beer was flowing, and the sound of hammers could be heard all across the state as people built secret compartments into their floorboards and hollowed out their Bibles to fit a flat glass flask. Georgia was dry on paper, but it was damp in practice. We had traded the open, regulated saloon for the dark, damp alleyway. We had traded the tax revenue for the blind tiger's profit. And we had discovered that the only thing more difficult than governing a man's actions is trying to govern his appetites. But while the South was busy hiding its jugs, the North was preparing to celebrate the end of the year with a different kind of ritual, one that involved a giant glowing ball, a pole, and a city that had decided that setting itself on fire was no longer the best way to say Happy New Year. The state of Georgia is currently nursing a collective headache. The near beer is as flat as a politician's promise, and the blind tiger is currently doing a brisk business in the back of a livery stable. But across the country, the world of art and spectacle was about to be turned upside down. Chapter 13, The Ziegfeld Follies Debut, or How to Distract a Bankrupt Nation with 50 Pounds of Feathers and a Smile. By July 1907, the citizens of New York were in desperate need of a distraction that didn't involve checking the stock ticker or peering nervously into their empty bank vaults. The heat was oppressive, the economy was a shambles, and the general mood of the city was that of a man who had just realized he was wearing his trousers backward at a funeral. It was the perfect moment for a man with a genius for vanity and a magnificent lack of shame to step onto the stage. Enter Florenz Ziegfeld, Jr., a man who viewed the world not as a collection of people, but as a vast, empty stage waiting for someone to glue a sequin to it. Ziegfeld was the Barnum of the boudoir, a man who realized that while the American public might claim to value character and industry, what they actually wanted was to see a great deal of silk, a fair amount of skin, and a production budget that could have successfully funded a small European war. On July 8, 1907, on the rooftop of the New York Theater, he unveiled the first Ziegfeld Follies. The architect of glamour, Ziegfeld didn't just want to put on a show, he wanted to glorify the American girl. Now, glorifying is a wonderful word. It suggests a religious experience, perhaps involving a choir and a holy relic. In Ziegfeld's hands, however, glorifying meant finding women who were exactly 5'5", possessed the poise of a duchess, and could maintain a smile while wearing a headdress that weighed more than a Thanksgiving turkey. He didn't want the rowdy, thigh-slapping burlesque of the 19th century. He found it common. Ziegfeld wanted class. He wanted his audience, the men who had survived the panic of 1907 with their silk hats intact, to feel that they were witnessing art. And he discovered that if you call a girl in tights a tableau vivant and surround her with velvet curtains, the critics will call it a cultural event rather than a reason to call the police. The Jardin de Paris, a roof with a view. The venue was the Jardin de Paris, a roof garden atop the New York Theater. In 1907, before the miracle of air conditioning had arrived to save our armpits, the roof garden was the height of luxury. It allowed the elite to watch a show while pretending to catch a breeze, and it offered the added benefit of being high enough above the street that the smell of the city's horses was merely a suggestion rather than a confrontation. The first Follies were modeled after the Folies Bergères of Paris, a city that Americans have always looked to for lessons in how to be scandalous while remaining sophisticated. But Ziegfeld added a distinctively American flavor: speed. The show was a rapid-fire collection of vaudeville acts, songs, and satirical sketches that poked fun at the very events we've been discussing. There were skits about the Panic of 1907, the Big Stick of Teddy Roosevelt, and the new obsession with the Model T, the 50-pound headdress. The real stars of the show, however, were the Ziegfeld girls. These were not mere dancers, they were a standardized product of American perfection. Ziegfeld picked them with the eye of a horse breeder and the obsession of a diamond merchant. He insisted on the finest silks from Paris and real ostrich feathers that had been plucked from birds that were likely wondering what they had done to deserve such a fate. There is a specific kind of physical endurance required to be a Ziegfeld girl, to walk across a stage with 50 pounds of wire beads and plumes balanced on your head, while looking as though you've just been born out of a lily, is a feat of athleticism that would put a professional wrestler to shame. Ziegfeld understood that the spectacle was everything. He realized that the human eye is a simple organ. It likes things that are shiny, things that move in unison, and things that look like they cost a great deal of money that the viewer doesn't have. A Ziegfeld girl doesn't just walk, she glides. She is a statue that has been given a heartbeat and a very expensive dressmaker. The Follies of the day. The 1907 Follies were a mirror of the year's absurdities. They featured a drum and bugle corps of girls in military-style uniforms, a direct nod to the Great White Fleet. They had a Gibson Girl segment, celebrating the illustrated ideal of the independent American woman. Independent, that is, as long as she could fit into a corset that reduced her waist to the circumference of a soup can. The humor was topical, cynical, and relentlessly upbeat. It was the Gilded Gulp in musical form. It told the audience that even if the banks were closed and the Japanese were counting our cannons, there was still a place where the lights were bright and the girls were pretty. It was the birth of the Broadway Revue, a form of entertainment that would dominate the American stage for the next 30 years. It turned the spectacle into a national industry. The cost of beauty. Ziegfeld's obsession with glorification was not cheap. He spent money with a recklessness that would have given J.P. Morgan a heart attack. If a costume didn't look right, he'd have it burned and remade. If a set piece wasn't grand enough, he'd order 10 more of them. He lived on credit, on charm, and on the absolute certainty that the American public would always pay to be dazzled. He was the perfect man for 1907. In a year of financial ruin, he was a man who acted as though money were an infinite resource, like air or bad advice. He provided a gilded refuge for a city that was currently feeling rather tarnished. The legacy of the sequins. The 1907 Follies changed the way America looked at itself. We began to equate entertainment with bigness. We decided that a show wasn't a success unless it had a cast of 100 and a costume budget that could feed a small city. Ziegfeld created the prototype for the Hollywood extravaganza, the Las Vegas showgirl, and the modern obsession with the celebrity. He taught us that if you put enough sequins on a spectacle, people will forget to ask if there's a point to it. He turned the American girl into a brand name, as recognizable as Ford or Bakelite. And he did it all while the world was trembling on the brink of a new, louder, and much less glorified century. As the final curtain fell on the first Follies, and the audience walked out into the New York night, they weren't thinking about the gentleman's agreement or the panic. They were thinking about feathers. And in 1907, that was the greatest service a man like Ziegfeld could perform. The lights of the Jardin de Paris are twinkling, the orchestra is playing a final flourish, and Florenz Ziegfeld is likely backstage, complaining that the ostrich feathers aren't proud enough. But while New York was celebrating the American girl, over in Paris, a young Spaniard was about to take a hammer to the very idea of beauty. Chapter 14. Picasso and the Cubist Headache. Or How to Paint the World Like It Just Fell Down a Flight of Stairs. While Florenz Ziegfeld was busy in New York, gluing sequins onto the concept of femininity until it glittered like a midday sun, a 25-year-old Spaniard in Paris was preparing to do something much more violent to the human form. If Ziegfeld was the man who polished the 20th century, Pablo Picasso was the man who took a hammer to its reflection. In 1907, in a dilapidated, rat-infested studio building in Montmartre known as the Bateau Lavoir, the laundry boat, Picasso unveiled a canvas that would effectively end the Renaissance. It was called Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, and to the few people who saw it that year, it looked less like a masterpiece and more like a collective hallucination experienced by someone who had spent too much time staring at broken glass. The Bateau Lavoir, the laboratory of the broken. To understand the Cubist headache, you must first understand the environment in which it was bred. The Bateau Lavoir was a building so structurally suspect that it was named after the laundry barges on the Seine, not because it was clean, but because it swayed in the wind and smelled faintly of damp wool and neglected hygiene. It was a place where geniuses lived on a diet of stale bread, cheap wine, and the kind of intense, brooding ambition that usually leads to either a revolution or a very long stay in a padded room. Picasso sat in his studio, surrounded by the ghosts of the old masters. For centuries, painting had been a polite game of let's pretend. Let's pretend this flat canvas is a window. Let's pretend these colors are a sunset. Let's pretend these women are goddesses. But Picasso, with the relentless energy of a man who had decided that the 20th century was going to be much faster and much uglier than the 19th, decided he was done pretending. The Five Women of the Apocalypse. Les Demoiselles d'Avignon depicts 5 women in a brothel on Avignon Street in Barcelona. Now, in the hands of a proper artist of the time, this would have been a soft, hazy scene designed to make a gentleman feel sophisticated while he looked at something scandalous. Picasso gave the world the opposite. He painted 5 women who looked like they had been assembled from the leftover parts of a shipwreck. The geometry. Their bodies were a riot of jagged edges, triangles, and mismatched perspectives. One woman's nose seemed to be departing for a different zip code. Another's eyes were looking in 2 different centuries simultaneously. The masks. 2 of the women had faces that resembled African tribal masks, fierce, distorted, and utterly lacking in Gilded Age charm. The space. The background wasn't behind them. It was in them. The curtains, the fruit, and the women were all splintered into the same geometric shards. It was as if Picasso had taken a photograph of a room and then sat on it until the reality cracked. The primitive theft. Picasso had recently spent a great deal of time at the Trocadero Museum staring at African and oceanic art. While the rest of Europe viewed these objects as primitive curiosities from the colonies, Picasso saw something else: power. He realized that these masks weren't trying to look like people. They were trying to be spirits. They were functional objects of magic. Picasso decided that Western art had become too sweet, too focused on being pretty. He wanted to steal that primitive energy and use it to shock the exhausted, over-civilized Europeans out of their stupor. He wasn't painting a scene. He was performing an exorcism on the concept of beauty. The reaction: you're drinking gasoline. When Picasso finally showed the work to his inner circle, the reaction was not exactly a standing ovation. In fact, most of them thought he had finally lost his mind to the fumes of his own turpentine. Henri Matisse, the other giant of the era, laughed out loud and called it a hoax. He thought Picasso was making fun of the modern movement. Georges Braque, who would eventually become Picasso's partner in Cubist crime, was horrified. He told Picasso, "Your painting makes us feel as if you were trying to make us eat tow or drink gasoline in order to spit fire." Even his most loyal supporters were baffled. They looked at the canvas and felt a physical ache behind their eyes, the first recorded instance of the Cubist headache. It was a painting that demanded you look at it from 5 different angles at once, in a world that was still used to looking at things from the safety of a single, fixed chair. The death of the pretty. Why did Picasso do it? Why would a man who could paint like Raphael by the age of 14 choose to paint like a distressed mathematician by the age of 25? The answer lies in the year 1907. As we have seen, this was a year of nervous breakdowns in the economy, in diplomacy, and in technology. The camera had already been invented. If you wanted a realistic picture of a woman, you could buy a Lumiere autochrome, as we'll see in the next chapter. Art no longer had a job as a recording device. Art's new job was to represent the interior chaos of the modern world. Picasso realized that the 20th century wasn't going to be a gentle stroll. It was going to be a high-speed collision of ideas, a world where time and space were being compressed by the telephone, the automobile, and the steam turbine. A pretty painting of a bowl of fruit was no longer an honest response to a world where J.P. Morgan could hold the entire economy in his library. I paint objects as I think them, not as I see them. Pablo Picasso, The Hidden Masterpiece. The reaction to Les Demoiselles was so overwhelmingly negative that Picasso actually rolled the canvas up and hid it in his studio for years. It wouldn't be shown to the general public until 1916. But the damage, or the progress, depending on your health insurance, was done. The headache had been planted. From this one painting, the entire modern art movement would grow. Cubism, Futurism, Surrealism, all of them were just ripples from the stone Picasso threw into the pond in 1907. He had taught the world that reality was a matter of opinion, and that a straight line was merely a triangle that had lost its ambition. The verdict of the shard. As 1907 drew to a close, the world was splintering, the economy was fractured, the Navy was a white-painted blur on the horizon, and now even the human face wasn't safe from the progress of the century. Picasso had successfully proved that you could make something beautiful by making it ugly, and that you could find the truth by breaking it into 1,000 pieces. It was a terrifying thought, but in a year of panics and plastic, it was perhaps the most honest thing anyone had done. The paint on Les Demoiselles is slowly drying in a dark corner of the Bateau Lavoie, and Picasso is likely looking for a new way to annoy his friends. But while he was deconstructing reality with a brush, the Lumiere brothers were figuring out how to capture it in something the world had never seen before: color. Chapter 15, The Lumiere Autochrome. Or how the world finally discovered that the sky wasn't gray. For the better part of the 19th century, humanity was laboring under a very specific and very monochromatic delusion. If you were to judge history by the evidence left behind in the family album, you would be forced to conclude that our ancestors lived in a world composed entirely of soot, fog, and various shades of depressing sepia. We have been conditioned to believe that George Washington lived in a world of gray mist, and that the Civil War was fought by men who bled different densities of charcoal. But in 1907, two French brothers named Auguste and Louis Lumiere, men who had already spent a fair amount of time annoying the public with moving pictures that made people feel seasick, decided it was time to turn on the lights. They released the autochrome, the first commercially successful process for color photography, and in doing so, they revealed a terrifying truth. The past was just as garishly colored, mustard yellow, and suspiciously stained as the present. The Great Potato Breakthrough. Now, if you were to ask a scientist how to capture the fleeting, ethereal beauty of a sunset on a glass plate, he might talk to you about the refraction of light, the properties of silver halides, or the delicate balance of the electromagnetic spectrum. But because the Lumiere brothers were French, they looked at this profound scientific challenge and decided the answer was potatoes. I am not joking. The foundation of modern color photography, the thing that allowed us to finally see the rosy cheeks of a Victorian child or the vibrant green of a 1907 garden, was microscopic grains of potato starch. The process was as follows. You take millions of tiny grains of potato starch. You dye them red-orange, green, and blue-violet. You mix them up until they look like a very colorful, very inedible dust. You spread them over a glass plate and fill the gaps with charcoal, because nothing says art like charred wood and tubers. You coat the whole thing in a light-sensitive emulsion. It was essentially a French fry method of capturing reality. You were looking at the world through a filter of dyed starch. It was brilliant, it was messy, and it meant that every photograph taken in 1907 carried with it the faint, invisible ghost of a potato. The physics of the pointillist nightmare. The autochrome didn't work like a modern camera. It didn't see color so much as it filtered it. When light hit the plate, the potato grains acted as tiny, colorful bouncers, only letting through the light that matched their own hue. The result was a photograph that didn't look like a crisp reality, but rather like a pointillist painting executed by someone with a very steady hand and a great deal of patience. Because the starch grains were physical objects, the images had a texture. They were grainy. They were hazy. They looked like a Monet painting that hadn't quite dried yet, or a memory of a dream you had after eating too much Roquefort cheese. The colors were never quite right. The reds were often a bit too brick-like, and the blues had a tendency to look like they had been borrowed from a laundry tub. But to a public that had only ever seen the world in shadow and light, the sight of a real red rose on a glass plate was enough to cause a collective fainting spell. Suddenly, the world wasn't a charcoal sketch anymore. It was a riot. The 6-second statue. However, there was a catch. There is always a catch when it comes to progress in 1907, because the light had to fight its way through a layer of charcoal and dyed potatoes before it could reach the film. The autochrome was remarkably slow. To take a successful color photograph, the shutter had to stay open for a very long time. In bright sunlight, you might have to stand perfectly still for several seconds. In the shade, you might be looking at a 30-second commitment. This is why everyone in early color photographs looks like they are suffering from a severe case of rigor mortis. If you wanted a color portrait of your dog in 1907, you either had to find a dog that was remarkably philosophical about the passage of time, or you had to have him taxidermied first. Most people chose the latter, or simply photographed their children, who were often threatened with the loss of their inheritance if they so much as blinked. This gave birth to the autochrome stare, that wide-eyed, desperate expression of a person who is trying very hard not to breathe while a Frenchman in a smock counts slowly to 10. It turned the act of photography back into a ritual of endurance. The mustard yellow past. The most striking thing about the autochrome was the glow. Because of the way the starch grains scattered the light, the images had a luminous, ethereal quality. It made the world of 1907 look incredibly peaceful, even while the economy was collapsing and J.P. Morgan was locking people in libraries. It also revealed that the fashion of the era was significantly more interesting than we had been led to believe. We discovered that the Gilded Age was actually the mustard and mauve age. The colors were dusty, saturated, and strangely warm. When the Lumiere plates were first shown to the public, people realized that their world was actually quite garish. The grass was too green, the sky was too blue, and their own complexions were significantly more pink and blotchy than the black and white photographers had let on. Color was a truth-teller, and like most truth-tellers, it was a bit of an unwanted guest at the party of Victorian vanity. The end of the gray myth. The Lumiere Autochrome stayed the industry standard for nearly 30 years, until Kodak decided that potatoes were a poor substitute for chemistry, and gave us Kodachrome. But for that brief window at the start of the century, the Autochrome was the only way to see the true face of the world. It changed the way we think about history. It reminded us that the people of 1907 didn't live in a world of shadows. They saw the same blue water of the Atlantic that the Lusitania was currently slicing through. They saw the same red clay of the newly formed Oklahoma, and they saw the same bright white paint of the Great White Fleet. By adding color, the Lumieres made the past touchable. They took the distance out of the 19th century and brought the 20th century into sharp, grainy focus. They proved that while history might be written in ink, it was lived in a technicolor haze of dyed starch and charcoal. The recipe for a 1907 memory. If you want to recreate the feeling of 1907, you don't need a time machine. You simply need a pound of potatoes for the filter, a very stiff collar to ensure you cannot move your neck, a total lack of a sense of humor to maintain the autochrome stare, a world that is currently falling apart to provide the necessary contrast. As the first color plates were developed in the Lumiere laboratory, a new era of human vanity began. We were no longer content with being remembered. We wanted to be remembered in full color. We wanted the world to know exactly how blue our ribbons were and exactly how red our wine was. We had conquered the spectrum, and all it had cost us was a few sacks of potatoes and the ability to breathe during a portrait. The glass plates are currently drying, the starch grains are settled, and the world is looking remarkably vibrant for a year that was technically in a depression. But while the French were making the world look like a painting, the city of Chicago was about to witness a miracle that was, quite frankly, even more unlikely than a potato-powered camera. Chapter 16. The Chicago Cubs Win a World Series. Or, the most dangerous thing in the world is a Chicagoan with a reason to be hopeful. If you were to walk the streets of Chicago in October 1907, you would find a city that smelled of lake spray, slaughterhouses, and a very specific, frantic brand of optimism. Chicago has always been a city that believes it is about to invent the future, usually by building something twice as tall as it needs to be, or by voting for the same man 3 times in a single election. But in 1907, the city's heart wasn't in the skyscrapers or the rail yards. It was centered on a patch of dirt where men in baggy wool flannels were busy proving that the shortest distance between 2 points is a well-aimed curveball. This was the year the Chicago Cubs became the undisputed kings of the world, or at least the undisputed kings of the parts of the world that understood the infield fly rule. They beat the Detroit Tigers to win the World Series, and they did it with such ruthless mechanical efficiency that the citizens of Chicago reached a very natural, very human, and very catastrophic conclusion. This is how it's always going to be. The dead ball era, a game of dirt and deception. To understand the baseball of 1907, you must first purge your mind of the modern spectacle. There were no flashing screens, no hot dogs wrapped in gold foil, and certainly no entertainment between innings other than watching the groundskeeper move a pile of dirt from one place to another. This was the dead ball era. The ball itself was a dark, lumpy object that had been used for 3 weeks, sat in a puddle, and was currently covered in tobacco juice, licorice, and the dark intentions of the pitcher. Hitting this ball was not a feat of strength. It was a feat of negotiation. You didn't swing for the fences because the fences were roughly 3 miles away and the ball had the aerodynamic properties of a wet sock. You poked it. You bunted it. You scratched and clawed for every inch of dirt. It was a game of inches, performed by men who looked like they had just finished a double shift at a coal mine and were playing the game primarily to avoid going home to their wives. The peerless leader and the Holy Trinity. The 1907 Cubs were led by Frank Chance, known as the peerless leader. Frank was a man who played first base with the grim determination of a tax collector and managed the team with the iron whim of a Prussian general. But the real soul of the team lived in the infield, in a rhythmic incantation that has since become a part of the American liturgy. Tinker to Evers to Chance. Joe Tinker, a shortstop who played like he was trying to catch a greased pig in a hurricane. Johnny Evers, a second baseman who weighed about as much as a wet umbrella, but possessed a temper that could set a lake on fire. Frank Chance, the aforementioned leader who caught everything that wasn't nailed down. Together, they turned the double play into a form of high art. They moved with a telepathic grace that suggested they were sharing a single, very cynical brain. They were the Gilded Age of defense, precise, cold, and utterly unforgiving of any runner who thought he could steal a base on their watch. The man with the missing finger. But a defense is only as good as the man on the mound, and the Cubs had a secret weapon that defied both logic and medical science. Mordecai Three-Finger Brown. Mordecai had lost most of 2 fingers on his right hand in a farm machinery accident as a child, the kind of character-building tragedy that 19th century rural life provided in abundance. However, rather than giving up on baseball and taking up a career in professional pointing, Brown discovered that his stump of a hand gave the ball a rotation that shouldn't exist in a 3-dimensional universe. When Brown threw a curveball, it didn't just break. It seemed to fall off a table, turn a corner, and then mock the batter for ever having been born. He was the most effective pitcher in the league, proving that in America, even a catastrophic encounter with a feed cutter can be turned into a lucrative career if you have enough grit and a good catcher. The Georgia Peach versus the Chicago Machine. In the 1907 World Series, the Cubs faced the Detroit Tigers and their legendary outfielder Ty Cobb. Now, Ty Cobb was known as the Georgia Peach, a nickname that is perhaps the most misleading piece of branding in human history. A peach is soft, sweet, and delightful at a picnic. Ty Cobb was a jagged piece of flint who would sharpen his spikes before a game just so the opposing infielders would have something to think about while he was sliding into them. Cobb was the greatest hitter in the game, but in 1907, the Chicago machine simply ate him alive. The Cubs' pitchers, led by the three-fingered wonder, held Cobb to a batting average that looked more like a temperature in January. The series began with a tie. Game 1 went 12 innings and was called due to darkness because, in 1907, we hadn't yet figured out how to put enough lightning on a stick to illuminate a ball field. But after that initial hiccup, the Cubs went on a tear. They won the next 4 games straight. They didn't just beat Detroit, they dismantled them. They played with a scientific precision that mirrored the new factories and the new corporations. They were the trust of baseball, efficient, monopolistic, and entirely without mercy. The delusion of permanence. When the final out was recorded and the Cubs were crowned champions, the city of Chicago erupted in a manner that suggested they had just discovered a cure for death. There were parades, there were speeches, and there was a great deal of the medicinal whiskey we discussed in the Georgia chapter. The fans looked at their team, this young, invincible collection of talent, and made the fatal mistake that all humans make in their moments of triumph. They assumed the graph would keep going up. Why wouldn't we win next year? They asked. And the year after that? We have the peerless leader. We have the three-fingered wonder. We have a system. We are Chicago. We have conquered the market. We have conquered the Atlantic with the Lusitania, and we have conquered the dirt with the Cubs. They were so certain of their dominance that they didn't realize they were standing at the very peak of a mountain, and the only way left to go was down, into a valley that would last for 108 years. The long, cold walk. They did win again in 1908, just to make the eventual fall even more hilarious to the gods of irony. But after that, the machine began to rust. Tinker, Evers, and Chance eventually stopped speaking to each other. Mordecai Brown's arm eventually tired. And the peerless leader eventually found that the world was full of peers who were getting much better at hitting the curveball. The 1907 victory was the gilded gulp of Chicago sports. It was a moment of supreme confidence before a century of wait until next year. It turned the Cubs fan into a specific kind of philosopher, a person who understands that joy is a fleeting commodity, and that hope is something you should only use in small controlled doses like arsenic. But in October 1907, the drought was unimaginable. The idea that 100 years would pass before another championship was as absurd as the idea of a man walking on the moon or a telephone you could carry in your pocket. The Cubs were the kings. The world was their oyster. And as they hoisted their trophy, which probably looked like a very expensive gravy boat, they truly believed they had built a dynasty that would outlast the very stars. The trophy is currently being polished. The fans are heading to the saloon to celebrate a victory they think will be an annual event, and Ty Cobb is likely back in Georgia, sharpening his spikes and plotting his revenge. But while the city of Chicago was celebrating its scientific victory, the Gilded Age was about to demand a much darker, much more literal price from the men who actually fueled the machine. Chapter 17. The Monongah Mining Disaster. Or, the high price of keeping the Gilded Age from getting chilly. If you have been paying attention to our little itinerary through the year 1907, you might be under the impression that the 20th century was mostly a matter of painting battleships white, inventing unmeltable billiard balls, and watching the Chicago Cubs play a game of scientific catch. It all seems very shiny, doesn't it? It's gilded from top to bottom. But I have noticed that whenever humanity builds a particularly tall, particularly shiny pedestal to stand on, there is usually a group of very tired, very soot-covered men in the basement holding the whole thing up and praying the ceiling doesn't cave in. In December 1907, while the rest of the country was preparing for Christmas and wondering if J.P. Morgan would let them have their money back, the ceiling finally did cave in. It happened in Monongah, West Virginia. It was the single worst industrial accident in the history of the United States, and it served as a grim, suffocating reminder that the progress we so loudly celebrate is often fueled by the lives of people whose names we can't pronounce and whose labor we'd rather not think about while we're sitting by a warm fire. The geography of the underworld. To understand Monongah, you must first understand the company town. A company town is a marvel of capitalistic efficiency. It is a place where one corporation owns the house you sleep in, the ground you walk on, the store where you buy your beans, and the very air you breathe, which in West Virginia in 1907 was composed of approximately 40% oxygen and 60% coal dust. The Fairmont Coal Company was the king of Monongah. They ran mines number 6 and number 8, two massive, interconnected labyrinths that stretched for miles beneath the rolling hills. These mines were the lungs of the Gilded Age. They provided the coal for the Lusitania's turbines, the heat for Ziegfeld's theaters, and the electricity for the Thor washing machines that were currently shocking the housewives of Chicago. Inside these mines, the new Americans we met at Ellis Island were put to work. There were Italians, Poles, Hungarians, and Russians, all working side by side in a darkness so absolute it made a moonless night look like a summer afternoon. They were paid by the ton, not by the hour, which is a clever way of ensuring that a man will ignore his own survival instincts in favor of moving just one more load of rock. The silent killer, methane, and a naked flame. The tragedy of Monongah was not an act of God. It was an act of arithmetic. In 1907, we knew quite a bit about mining. We knew that coal dust is more explosive than gunpowder if you get it into the air. We knew that pockets of methane gas, which the miners called fire damp, lurk in the seams like a sleeping dragon. And we knew that if you introduce a naked flame to a dragon, the dragon generally reacts poorly. But safety costs money. Ventilation fans cost money. Electric lamps that don't spark cost money. And in the wake of the panic of 1907, money was the one thing the coal barons were holding on to tighter than a drowning man holds onto a life vest. The miners went into the earth carrying open flame lamps on their hats. Imagine, if you will, walking into a room filled with spilled gasoline while holding a lit candle and then spending 12 hours swinging a pickaxe. Now imagine doing that 1,000 feet underground with no exit. It wasn't a question of if the mine would explode. It was a question of whether the explosion would happen before or after lunch. December 6th. The earth burps. At 10:28 a.m. on Friday, December 6th, the dragon finally woke up. A series of explosions ripped through mines number 6 and number 8 with such force that the earth literally shuddered for miles. It wasn't just a bang. It was a subterranean thunder that turned the mine shafts into giant cannon barrels. The ventilation fans, those lungs of the mine, were blown clear out of their housings. The heavy iron tracks for the coal cars were twisted into pretzels. In the town of Monongah, the windows rattled in their frames. Women ran to the mine entrances, their aprons still dusted with flour, only to find the mouths of the caves choked with black, oily smoke. The official and unofficial count. The official death toll was 362. It is a number that sounds precise, doesn't it? It suggests that someone was keeping a very careful ledger, but in the Gilded Age, the ledger only counted the people who were officially on the payroll. It didn't count the slabbies, the young boys who went into the mines with their fathers to help them load more coal so they could earn a few extra pennies. It didn't count the unregistered cousins who had just arrived from Naples and were working off the books. The actual number of lives lost in the Monongah disaster was likely closer to 500. The rescue efforts were a desperate, heartbreaking farce. Without ventilation, the mines were filled with afterdamp, a poisonous cocktail of carbon monoxide and nitrogen that kills a man as surely as a bullet, only more quietly. The rescuers, mostly other miners who had been off shift, went into the darkness with nothing but wet cloths over their faces. They found men who had died in mid-swing, men who had sat down to eat their lunch and simply never stood up, and men who had tried to crawl toward the surface until their lungs simply gave out. The Thoughts and Prayers of 1907. The reaction of the Fairmont Coal Company was a master class in what we would now call public relations. They expressed their deepest sympathies. They pointed out that the mine had passed an inspection just a few weeks prior, conducted, of course, by a man whose salary was essentially paid by the coal industry. They suggested that perhaps a miner had been careless with a lamp. In the Gilded Age, the blame always traveled downward, much like the soot. If 500 people died, it was surely the fault of one man with a match rather than the system that required the match in the first place. The state of West Virginia was also remarkably philosophical about the tragedy. They didn't see a need for new laws. They saw a need for more funerals. It wasn't until the public outcry reached a fever pitch, and until several more mines exploded in Pennsylvania and Alabama in the same month, that the government in Washington realized that waiting for the earth to stop exploding was a poor long-term strategy. The birth of the Bureau of Mines. The Monongah disaster was so catastrophic that even the small government enthusiasts of the era couldn't ignore it. It led directly to the creation of the United States Bureau of Mines in 1910. For the first time, the federal government decided that it might be a good idea to research why mines explode and perhaps suggest that not blowing up should be a priority for the owners. It was a classic American after-the-fact solution. We are a nation that loves to build a bridge, wait for it to collapse, and then pass a law requiring that bridges be made of something other than hope and balsa wood. The Widows of Monongah. The real legacy of 1907 wasn't the Bureau of Mines. It was the Black Widows. Monongah became a town of women and children. On one single street, every single man had been killed. The company, in an act of staggering generosity, allowed the widows to stay in their company-owned houses for a few months before they were asked to move along to make room for the new crop of miners coming in from Ellis Island. It was the dark side of the Gilded Gulp. For every billionaire in a library and every girl in a feathered headdress, there was a widow in Monongah trying to figure out how to feed 4 children on a payout from a relief fund that amounted to less than the price of a first-class ticket on the Lusitania. The verdict of the soot. As we look back at 1907, we must remember that the modern world was not a gift from the gods. It was a purchase made on credit, and the bill was paid in West Virginia coal mines. The Monongah disaster reminds us that efficiency is often just another word for negligence with a better haircut. It teaches us that the most expensive thing in the world is a cheap source of energy. And it tells us that if you're going to call your age gilded, you better make sure you aren't looking too closely at the hands of the people who did the gilding. The smoke has finally cleared from the hills of West Virginia. The funerals are over, and the mines are, God help us, back in operation. The world needs its coal, and the 20th century is a hungry beast. But while the working class was dealing with the harsh reality of the underworld, the upper class in New York was preparing for a scandal that would prove that being rich and stupid is a much more colorful way to ruin your life. Chapter 18. The Trial of Harry K. Thaw. Or, why you should never invite a millionaire to a roof garden if you've previously swung his wife. In the grand, colorful history of the American courtroom, we have a peculiar habit of labeling every legal proceeding involving a person with a large bank account and a small amount of impulse control as the trial of the century. We've had so many trials of the century that the century itself is starting to feel a bit crowded, like a life raft holding 3 times its capacity in lawyers and tabloid reporters. But in 1907, the title actually felt earned. This was the trial of Harry K. Thaw, a man who proved that if you have enough railroad money, you don't need a personality. You just need a very good tailor and a very creative psychiatrist. It was a saga involving a famous architect, a girl in a red velvet swing, and the first recorded instance of a brainstorm being used as a legal defense for cold-blooded murder. The players, a trinity of trouble. To understand the 1907 trial, you must first understand the 3 people who managed to turn a warm June evening in New York into a national obsession. Stanford White, the victim. He was the most famous architect in America, the White in McKim, Mead, and White. He designed the Boston Public Library, the Washington Square Arch, and the very building where he was eventually murdered, Madison Square Garden. He was a man of immense talent and even more immense appetites, specifically for young women whom he liked to push on a velvet swing in a secret apartment hidden inside a clock tower. Evelyn Nesbit, the girl in the red velvet swing. She was the world's first supermodel. Her face was on every postcard and advertisement in the country. She was the it girl, before we even knew what it was. She was 19, beautiful, and had the unfortunate luck of being the prize in a tug-of-war between a philandering genius and a lunatic heir. Harry K. Thaw, the murderer. He was the heir to a $40 million Pittsburgh coal and railroad fortune. Harry was a man who, to put it gently, had a few screws loose and several others that were merely stripped. He was obsessed with purity, which is a dangerous thing for a man with a whip and a history of mental instability to be obsessed with. He hated Stanford White with the fire of 1,000 suns, mostly because White had ruined Evelyn before Harry married her. The crime, murder at the musical. The murder actually took place on the night of June 25, 1906, but it wasn't until the trial began in January 1907 that the true, lurid details were paraded before a horrified and delighted public. The setting was the rooftop garden of Madison Square Garden, a building Stanford White had designed. A musical called Mam'selle Champagne was being performed. It was, by all accounts, a terrible show. During the finale, Harry Thaw approached White's table, pulled a .22 caliber Savage pistol from beneath his overcoat, which he was wearing in June, a sure sign of a man with a plan, and shot White 3 times in the face at point-blank range. Thaw then raised the gun over his head, looking like a triumphant gargoyle, and shouted, "You'll never go out with that woman again." He then surrendered to a policeman, presumably because he wanted to make sure someone was there to see his dramatic exit. The trial, the greatest show on earth. When the trial opened in January 1907, New York City stopped breathing. This wasn't just a murder trial. It was a collision between the old guard of New York society and the nouveau riche of Pittsburgh, with a heavy seasoning of sex, drugs, and high-end architecture. The courtroom was a madhouse. Thousands of people stood in the snow outside the courthouse just for a chance to see Evelyn Nesbit walk through the door. Inside, the press sat in rows, scribbling down every word with a ferocity that suggested they were being paid by the adjective, which, in the age of Hearst and Pulitzer, they likely were. The brainstorm defense. Harry Thaw's lead attorney was Delphin Delmas, a man who possessed a silver tongue and a remarkably flexible relationship with medical science. He knew that Thaw had shot White in front of 100 witnesses, so he couldn't argue that Harry didn't do it. Instead, he argued that Harry couldn't help it. Delmas coined a term that would become legendary: dementia americana. He argued that any red-blooded American man would be driven to a temporary brainstorm of insanity if he discovered that a beast like Stanford White had taken the virtue of his wife. It was not the act of a murderer, Delmas thundered, but the act of a man whose mind had been shattered by the realization of a great wrong. It was a brilliant strategy. It allowed the jury to ignore the fact that Thaw was a violent, unstable man who had once whipped a girl in a bathtub, and instead see him as a defender of womanhood. It was the Gilded Age version of the he-needed-killin' defense. Evelyn's testimony, the virgin and the villain. The climax of the trial was the testimony of Evelyn Nesbit. She took the stand dressed in a schoolgirl outfit, a navy blue suit with a white collar, designed to make her look like an innocent child rather than the world's most famous model. She spent days on the stand, detailing her seduction by Stanford White years earlier. She spoke of the red velvet swing, the mirrors on the bedroom ceiling, and the champagne that made her sleepy. It was the first time the American public had been given such a detailed look into the secret lives of the elite, and they devoured it like a starving dog devours a steak. The trial turned Evelyn into a martyr, and Stanford White, who was, remember, the victim, into a predatory monster. The moral of the story, according to the newspapers, was that if you design a building, you should probably make sure you don't get murdered in it by the husband of a girl you once pushed on a swing. The verdict and the aftermath. The 1907 trial ended in a hung jury. Apparently, half the jury thought Thaw was a hero, and the other half thought he was a nutcase. A second trial in 1908 would eventually find him not guilty by reason of insanity. Thaw was sent to the Mattawan State Hospital for the criminally insane, which is a place that sounds very serious until you realize that Thaw lived there like a king. He had his own meals catered from outside, he had his own furniture, and he eventually simply walked out the front door and took a train to Canada. When he was eventually caught and brought back, he was greeted by cheering crowds. He had become a folk hero, the man who stood up for the sanctity of the home by shooting an architect in the face during a musical comedy. The legacy of the brainstorm. The Thaw trial was the moment the American legal system realized that celebrity was more powerful than evidence. It taught us that if the story is lurid enough and the players are beautiful enough, the truth is merely a secondary consideration. It also marked the end of the Gilded Age of architecture. Stanford White's buildings, grand, ornate, and full of hidden rooms, became symbols of a decadence that the 20th century was starting to find unpalatable. We were moving away from the velvet swing and towards the Model T. As 1907 drew to a close, the trial of the century left a lingering scent of scandal over New York. We had seen the best and the worst of ourselves in that courtroom, and we found that we liked the worst part significantly better. We had traded our progress for a brainstorm, and we were ready for a drink, even if we had to hide it in Georgia. The courtroom is finally being swept. The reporters are heading to the bars to write their final columns, and Harry Thaw is currently ordering a steak in his asylum room. But while the elite were busy shooting each other, New York City was preparing for a new kind of spectacle, one that didn't involve a revolver, but rather a giant glowing sphere and a very long pole. Chapter 19. The First Times Square Ball Drop. Or, How to Welcome the Future by Dropping 700 Pounds of Iron on It. As the year 1907 prepared to slink into the history books, hopefully without tripping over its own feet or causing another run on the banks, the citizens of New York City found themselves in a peculiar predicament. They wanted to celebrate the arrival of 1908 with a kind of deafening pyrotechnic enthusiasm that usually results in several city blocks being reduced to charcoal. But the municipal authorities had finally decided that setting the city on fire was a poor long-term strategy for civic growth. For years, the place to be on New Year's Eve was Trinity Church, where people gathered to hear the bells and occasionally to set off enough fireworks to make the British think the Revolutionary War had resumed. But by 1904, the center of gravity had shifted uptown to Longacre Square, recently renamed Times Square, in honor of a certain newspaper that had built a tower there and possessed a remarkable talent for self-promotion. Adolph Ochs, the publisher of the New York Times, had spent the previous few years putting on spectacular firework displays from the top of his tower. It was a marvelous tradition, provided you didn't mind hot ash raining down on your silk hat or the occasional flaming rocket landing in your carriage. However, by late 1907, the New York Police Department had reached its limit of patience. They banned the fireworks, leaving Ochs with a beautiful tower, a massive crowd of expectant revelers, and absolutely no way to entertain them other than perhaps having the editorial staff read the obituary section aloud. The gimmick of the glowing sphere. Faced with a silent midnight, Oakes did what any good newspaperman does. He looked for a gimmick. He consulted his chief electrician, Walter Palmer, and they hit upon a concept that was as technologically impressive as it was fundamentally absurd. They decided to build a giant ball, cover it in light bulbs, and drop it down a flagpole at the stroke of midnight. Now, to a modern mind, dropping a ball is a metaphor for failure, an admission of incompetence, or something one does with a hot potato. But in 1907, it was a gesture borrowed from the high-stakes world of maritime navigation. For decades, time balls had been used in harbors like Portsmouth and Greenwich. A large ball would be dropped at a precise moment, usually 1 p.m., so that ship captains out in the harbor could synchronize their chronometers. Oakes decided to take this sober nautical tradition and turn it into a piece of electric vaudeville. If the sailors could use a falling ball to set their watches, the people of New York could use one to set their lives. The iron and wood monstrosity. The first ball was not the sparkling Waterford crystal masterpiece that we see today. The 1907 version was a 700-pound beast made of iron and wood, measuring 5 feet in diameter. It looked less like a symbol of hope and more like a piece of experimental weaponry designed by a Victorian mad scientist. It was covered in 125-watt light bulbs, which in 1907 was a staggering amount of artificial lightning. Remember, most of the country was still reading by the flickering yellow light of a kerosene lamp or a particularly bright firefly. To see 100 electric bulbs gathered in one place, glowing with the white-hot intensity of the future, was enough to make a man believe that the 20th century might actually be as bright as the advertisements claimed. The construction of the ball was handled by Artcraft Strauss, a company that would go on to build most of the neon signs that turned Times Square into the world's most famous headache. They built it to be sturdy, which was wise, considering it had to survive being hauled up a flagpole in the middle of a New York winter and then dropped with enough force to potentially crack the roof of the building if the brakes failed. The man-powered countdown. In 1907, we didn't have computers to coordinate the drop. We didn't even have a particularly reliable stopwatch. The countdown was a remarkably manual affair. A crew of 6 men was stationed on the roof of the Times building. Their job was to wait for a signal from the Western Union Telegraph Office, which was the official keeper of time. And then at exactly 1 minute to midnight, they would begin lowering the 700-pound iron ball by hand, using a series of pulleys and ropes. Imagine the scene: 6 men in wool coats, their knuckles white, their breath visible in the freezing air, slowly lowering a glowing iron sphere while 200,000 people below screamed their heads off. If they lowered it too fast, the new year would arrive early. Too slow, and 1907 would linger like an unwanted house guest. It was a masterpiece of low-tech high tension. There is something uniquely American about celebrating the future by watching a heavy object fall toward the ground. It suggests that we understand gravity, even if we don't quite understand the interest rates. The crowd of 200,000. By 11 p.m. on December 31, 1907, Times Square was a sea of humanity. There were 200,000 people packed into the bow tie, a number that would have been unimaginable just a decade earlier. They were a cross-section of the year we have just endured. There were the bankers who had survived J.P. Morgan's library, the immigrants who had survived the button hook at Ellis Island, the housewives who had survived their Thor washing machines, and the Cubs fans who were still basking in the glow of a World Series victory they assumed would be a permanent state of being. They were loud, they were boisterous, and they were armed with tin horns. In 1907, the standard way to celebrate New Year's was to blow into a long tin horn until your lungs hurt and your neighbor's ears bled. The sound of 200,000 tin horns in the canyon of Broadway was said to be audible all the way to New Jersey, a fact that the residents of New Jersey have never truly forgiven. The midnight flash. As the ball reached the bottom of the pole, it triggered a massive 1908 sign that had been built into the side of the building. The lights of the ball were extinguished, the sign flashed to life, and the crowd erupted in a roar that was part joy and part relief. The panic of 1907 was officially over. By the simple act of dropping a ball, we had declared that the old problems were now last year's business. We had convinced ourselves that the calendar was a reset button. We had traded 365 days of copper scandals, mining disasters, and cubist headaches for a brand new, shiny, and presumably more sensible 1908. The irony of the falling ball. As I look back from the perspective of 1907, I can't help but appreciate the irony of the ceremony. We had spent the entire year watching things fall. We watched the stock market fall in October. We watched the Knickerbocker Trust fall in the same month. We watched the standard of living fall for the miners in West Virginia. We watched the moral standing of the elite fall in the Thaw trial. And so, to end the year, we gathered together to watch a 700-pound ball fall. It was the ultimate gilded gulp. We had turned the act of dropping the ball into a ritual of hope. We had decided that if we were going to fall, we might as well do it with 100 light bulbs attached and a crowd of 200,000 people cheering us on. The legacy of the drop. Adolph Ochs had intended the ball drop to be a one-time event, but the public reaction was so overwhelming that it became a permanent fixture of the New York landscape. It transformed Times Square from a mere intersection into the crossroads of the world. It taught us that the American public doesn't need fire and explosions to be happy. They just need a countdown and a sense of shared anticipation. It gave us the New Year's Eve we know today, a celebration that is less about the past and entirely about the next 60 seconds. As the 1908 sign glowed over the square and the tin horns continued to blare, the people of New York began to disperse. They walked home through the cold air, feeling a bit lighter, a bit more hopeful, and blissfully unaware that 1908 was waiting for them with a whole new set of challenges involving a man named Henry Ford and a car that would ensure they'd never have to walk to a New Year's party again. The ball is currently being hauled back up the pole for next year, the light bulbs are being unscrewed for storage, and the janitors of Times Square are facing a literal mountain of confetti and broken tin horns. But while New York was celebrating the arrival of 1908, the rest of the world was already cranking the engine. Chapter 20. 1908 is cranking the engine. Or, how to trade the peace of the past for the smell of burnt oil. The morning of January 1st, 1908, dawned with a very specific kind of silence, the kind that exists only when 200,000 tin horn-tooting New Yorkers have finally gone to bed to sleep off a combination of cheap champagne and the realization that they are still technically broke. The gilded gulp of 1907 had been swallowed, digested, and, in some cases, violently regurgitated. We had seen the banks collapse, the Navy go on a white-painted world tour, and the very concept of reality splinter into cubist shards. We had survived the year of the nervous breakdown, and now, as the sun rose over the frozen Atlantic, the world was preparing to do something it had never done before. It was going to start itself with a crank. If 1907 was the year of the wait and see, 1908 was the year of the go and do. It was the year humanity finally stopped talking about the future as a distant, polite suggestion and started building it out of steel, rubber, and a truly reckless disregard for the speed limit. The 20th century was no longer a toddler taking its first shaky steps. It was a teenager who had just found the keys to his father's liquor cabinet and a very fast car. The prophet of the piston, Henry Ford. In Detroit, a man with the lean, hungry look of a person who had never quite forgiven a horse for being a biological entity, was busy in a shed. Henry Ford had spent 1907 watching the rich people buy cars that cost more than a cathedral and broke down twice as often. He looked at the Gilded Age automobile, a brass-covered toy for the elite, and he decided it was a pile of nonsense. Henry didn't want a car that was a status symbol. He wanted a car that was an appliance. He wanted something that had the personality of a shovel and the reliability of a tax collector. In 1908, he would unveil the Model T. Now, the Model T was not pretty by the standards of the Ziegfeld Follies. It didn't have silk curtains or mahogany paneling. It came in one color, black, because black paint dried the fastest. And Henry Ford was a man who viewed the passage of time as a personal insult to his profit margins. But the Model T did something revolutionary. It worked. Before the Model T, owning a car was a hobby that required a full-time mechanic and the patience of a saint. After the Model T, owning a car was something a farmer in Oklahoma could do while simultaneously arguing about oil rights. Ford was democratizing the engine. He was taking the power of the steam turbine and the explosion of the coal mine and putting it into the hands of a man who just wanted to get to town without his horse dying of a heart attack halfway there. "I will build a motor car for the great multitude," Ford famously declared, and he did. He created a world where everyone could be late for dinner at the same time. He gave us the assembly line, a system of manufacturing that turned the human worker into a cog in a machine, a progress that ensured we could produce things faster than we could possibly think of a reason to need them. The rights take the world by the throat. While Ford was conquering the dirt, two brothers from Ohio were busy conquering the air. For years, the world had treated Wilbur and Orville Wright as a pair of clever liars. Even after their flight at Kitty Hawk in 1903, the general public, and especially the French, remained skeptical. They assumed the flying machine was a hoax, a trick of the light, or perhaps just a very large, very confused bird. But in 1908, the Wright brothers finally decided to stop being shy. Wilbur packed up their flyer and went to France, while Orville headed to Fort Myer in Virginia to show the U.S. Army that the big stick could now be delivered from the clouds. When Wilbur took off at a racecourse near Le Mans in August 1908, the French skeptics didn't just eat their words, they choked on them. Wilbur didn't just hop off the ground. He banked, he turned, he flew in circles, and he stayed in the air for so long that the crowd began to suspect he had made a deal with the devil. He handled the machine with the grace of a seagull, while the French aviators, who had been trying to fly machines that looked like winged grand pianos, could only watch in silent Gallic horror. A few weeks later, Orville was doing the same in Virginia. The age of flight had officially arrived. We had conquered the one thing that had kept humanity humble for 10,000 years, gravity. It was a magnificent achievement, though I'm sure if the people of 1908 could have seen a modern airport security line, they might have decided to stay on the ground and keep the horse. The human mountain and the silver tongue. And then there was the matter of the presidency. Teddy Roosevelt, true to his word and perhaps a bit to his own regret, was stepping down. He had handpicked his successor, William Howard Taft. Taft was a man of immense character, immense legal knowledge, and, most notably to the cartoonists of the day, immense physical presence. He was a human mountain, a man who required a specially reinforced bathtub in the White House just so he wouldn't become a permanent fixture of the plumbing. He was the conservative answer to Teddy's progressive fire. Opposing him was William Jennings Bryan, the boy orator of the Platte, who was running for president for the third time. Bryan was a man who possessed a voice that could rattle the windows of a barn from 3 miles away, and a set of ideas that the American public found fascinating, but ultimately unelectable. He was the professional loser of American politics, a man who spent his life proving that you can be absolutely right about the cross of gold and still lose to a man who looks like he's made of marshmallows. The election of 1908 was a foregone conclusion. Taft was the shadow of Roosevelt, and in 1908, Roosevelt's shadow was still the most popular thing in the country. We chose stability. We chose the big man. We decided that after the panic and the follies, we wanted a president who wouldn't move too fast or shout too loudly. We wanted a man who would sit in the chair and stay there. The final verdict on the gilded gulp. As we look back at the road map of 1907, we see a year that was a bridge. It was the last gasp of the old world and the first scream of the new. We had swallowed the gilded gulp, the excess, the greed, the vanity of the battleship, and the absurdity of the gentleman's agreement. We had survived the crash of the market and the explosion of the mine. We had seen the world in black and white, in sepia, and finally in the potato-starched color of the autochrome. We were entering 1908 with a lighter heart but a much louder environment. The world was no longer quiet. It was full of the chug-chug of the Model T, the whir of the Wright Flyer, and the clatter of the assembly line. We had traded the gilded for the galvanized. We were no longer a nation of farmers and philosophers. We were a nation of mechanics and consumers. The Gilded Age was over. The machine age had begun. And as the engine of 1908 sputtered to life, releasing a cloud of blue smoke and the promise of a faster tomorrow, we all took a deep breath, checked our pockets to make sure J.P. Morgan hadn't taken the last of our change, and prepared to drive into a century that was going to be many things: fast, loud, dangerous, and occasionally magnificent. But it was never, ever going to be a gentle stroll again. The engine has finally caught. The gears are grinding, and the Model T is rattling down a dirt road toward a horizon we can't quite see yet. The Gilded Gulp is a memory, and 1908 is calling. Thank you for traveling through the wreckage and the wonder of 1907. Keep your hands inside the vehicle, watch out for the cubist headaches, and for heaven's sake, don't forget to wind your watch. The end. This has been Mark Twain.